Hey there, friend. Welcome back, or if this is your first time here, welcome home. Get yourself settled in, adjust your pillow, pull the blanket just a little bit closer, because tonight we're not going anywhere dramatic. We are not chasing wars or kings or collapsing empires. Tonight we're going somewhere far more intimate than that. Tonight we're walking the streets. Picture this. It is somewhere around the year 1855. You're standing on a cobblestone street in London. The air smells like coal smoke, river mud, roasted chestnuts, and something frying in hot fat that you cannot quite identify, but your stomach is already interested. Everywhere around you, the city is alive in a way that feels almost impossible. Men are shouting, women are haggling, children are darting between legs like small, determined fish. And right there, 3 feet in front of you, a man in a battered hat is holding out a steaming hot pie and saying with complete sincerity, "Penny a pie, sir, best pie in all of London." You have exactly 1 penny in your pocket. You are very hungry, and you have absolutely no idea what is inside that pie. Do you take it? Well, by the end of tonight's story, you might actually think twice before you answer that question. Before we step into this world together, if this kind of slow, late-night storytelling is something you enjoy, something that makes the end of the day feel a little softer, a little warmer, it would mean a great deal if you hit that like button and maybe subscribe so we can keep these evenings going. And I am genuinely curious, where in the world are you listening to this right now? Are you curled up in bed with the lamp already turned low, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of tea that is slowly going cold, maybe in the car driving somewhere quiet in the dark? Drop it in the comments. I read every single one. And now dim the lights just a little bit more. Let the outside world do whatever it needs to do without you for a while. Tonight belongs to us. Now, let us talk about the city. Because to understand the food, to truly understand why a penny pie on a London street corner mattered so deeply to so many people, you first need to understand just how overwhelmingly, breathtakingly, almost violently large Victorian London had become. In the year 1801, London held roughly 960,000 people, nearly 1 million souls crammed into a city that had been built for far fewer. That is already an enormous number. But here is the thing, London did not stop there. By 1851, just 50 years later, the population had more than doubled to over 2.5 million. By 1871, it was 3.25 million. By 1891, over 4 million. And by the turn of the 20th century, Greater London had swelled to more than 6.5 million people. 6.5 million. To put that in perspective, by the 1860s, London was 1/4 larger than the second most populated city on Earth, which was Beijing. It was 2/3 larger than Paris, and it was 5 times larger than New York City. 5 times. London was not just a city. It was the city. The largest, loudest, most complicated human settlement the world had ever produced. And all of those people, those millions of factory workers, dockhands, seamstresses, coal carriers, shop girls, street sweepers, all of them woke up every single morning with the same urgent, biological, deeply inconvenient problem. They were hungry. Here is something we rarely stop to think about because it seems so obvious. But in the Victorian era, it was not obvious at all. It was a crisis. When hundreds of thousands of working-class people poured into London from the countryside, lured by factory wages, driven by famine, pushed by poverty, they arrived without something most of us take completely for granted today. They arrived without kitchens, or rather they arrived into tenement rooms and cellar lodgings so small, so dark, so overcrowded that cooking was simply not something that happened there. A typical lodging in the East End of London might house an entire family, father, mother, 3 or 4 children in a single room, maybe 12 feet by 10, with no fireplace safe enough to cook on no running water, no storage for food, and no table large enough to sit around even if there had been anything to put on it. One reporter in the 1840s described visiting a family in Whitechapel that was the heart of the East End and finding 8 people living in a room the size of a modern bathroom. 8 people. And the journalist Henry Mayhew, who spent years walking these streets and writing down what he saw and heard, noted something that sounds almost poetic when you read it now, but was simply the hard truth of working-class life. He wrote that the men and women of the London streets were people whose lives ran on alternation between starvation and surfeit. They ate when they could, they went hungry when they could not, and when they did eat they needed something quick, hot, cheap and easy to carry. They needed street food, and London delivered. Oh, did London deliver? Because while those millions of hungry workers were flooding into the city, something extraordinary was happening on the streets around them. An entire ecosystem of food was growing up to meet them. The Dictionary of Victorian London, one of the most detailed records we have of everyday life in this period, estimated that by the height of the Victorian era, there were over 6,000 food vendors working the streets of London on any given day. 6,000. That is not a food market. That is an entire parallel economy operating in the open air on every corner and in every alley from before dawn until well past midnight. And these were not all the same, not even close. There was the pieman wandering through the evening crowds with a tray of hot pies balanced against his chest. There was the watercress girl, sometimes as young as 6 years old, selling small bunches of fresh cress from a basket at 4 in the morning, before the rest of the city was even awake. There was the man with the hot eel cart calling out from the shadow of a gas lamp, "Warm your hands and fill your bellies for a halfpenny." There was the coffee stall woman setting up her trestle table at the corner of some foggy intersection, before the sun came up pouring hot drinks for police constables and night watchmen, and cab drivers who had been out in the cold all night. There was the muffin man, his little bell ringing down the street, his tray of warm muffins wrapped in a cloth to hold the heat. There was the baked potato seller, his cart a small portable oven, the smell of hot starch rising into the cold air like a little private paradise. Each one of these people had a story. Each one had a territory, a daily route, a set of customers who counted on them a specific rhythm to their day that had been worked out through years of hard experience. And together this whole sprawling, shouting, steaming, fragrant, chaotic chorus of them, they were something that had never quite existed before in human history. They were the world's first large-scale urban fast food industry, long before there was a golden arch anywhere, long before anyone had ever heard the word franchise. Victorian London invented the idea of feeding a city on the go. Now here is where it gets interesting, because the story of Victorian street food is not just a story about economics. It is not just a story about hunger and poverty and industrialization, though it is certainly all of those things too. It is also a story about class, about what you were allowed to eat and what eating a certain thing said about who you were. Victorian society was obsessed, and I mean genuinely, almost pathologically obsessed with the idea of respectability. The aspiring working class, the people who were trying to climb even half a rung up the social ladder, were deeply anxious about being seen eating in the street. Because eating in the street marked you as common, as rough, as the kind of person who could not manage to feed themselves at a proper table indoors. And yet the street food was everywhere. It was cheap. It was hot. It was often the only meal available. And so, a fascinating social performance played out on the streets of Victorian London every single day. People who privately depended entirely on street food for their survival would eat it quickly, discreetly facing a wall, or turning slightly away from the crowd. And people who had a little more money would sometimes go out of their way to be seen not eating street food, even as their neighbours were wolfing down a penny eel or a hot baked potato with every sign of deep satisfaction. Henry Mayhew noticed this. He wrote about it with a kind of gentle, compassionate humour that I find rather wonderful. He described how the street sellers, especially the sellers of hot eels and pea soup, had their most loyal customers, not among the very poor who sometimes could not afford even a halfpenny, but among the skilled workers, the plumbers, the carpenters, the printers, men who earned enough to eat indoors if they chose, but who genuinely preferred the hot, salty, immediate pleasure of something eaten right there on the street straight from the pot. Because sometimes, no matter who you are, no matter what century you live in, nothing in the world beats standing on a cold pavement on a winter evening with something warm in both hands. There is something else worth knowing about this world before we go any further. Something that will make everything that follows feel a little more vivid and perhaps a little more urgent. Victorian London was not a safe city for food. It was not even a safe city for breathing, really. The Thames, which ran through the heart of everything, was not a river in any pristine sense. By the mid-1800s, it was an open sewer. Hundreds of thousands of gallons of raw sewage flowed into it every day from the city's overloaded drainage systems. And that same water, that thick, stinking, disease-carrying water, was also the source from which many street food vendors drew the water they used for washing their equipment, for cleaning their cups, for rinsing their hands. The great cholera epidemics that swept through London in 1832 and again in 1848 and 1854 killed tens of thousands of people. Many of those people ate street food, not necessarily because of it, but the streets were where the contamination was densest, where the crowds were thickest, where the water was least likely to be clean, and yet the food kept being sold, and the people kept buying it, because they had to eat. Because even a risky hot pie was better than no pie at all, because hunger, as it always has, ultimately won out over caution. And this is the world we're going to explore tonight. Not the London of Buckingham Palace and silk dresses and afternoon tea served in bone china cups. The other London. The London that ran on pennies and hunger and incredible, stubborn, noisy human ingenuity. The London that smelled of frying fish and hot sugar and river mud and coal smoke all at once. The London where a man could build an entire life, a culture, a community, a kind of rough dignity out of a wheelbarrow, a handful of produce and a voice loud enough to carry over a crowd. We're going to meet the people who fed this city. We're going to find out what they sold, how they lived, what tricks they played on their customers, and what extraordinary innovations they accidentally created. Some of what you hear tonight will make you hungry. Some of it will make you enormously glad you live in the era of food safety regulations. And some of it, I genuinely promise you, this will surprise you in ways you did not expect. Because the story of what people ate on the streets of Victorian London is in the end a story about something much bigger than food. It is a story about what human beings do when they are crowded together, when they are hungry, when they are poor, when they are creative, and when they are absolutely determined to survive. And speaking of survival, let us talk about the most powerful figure in this entire story. The person who stood at the very centre of Victorian London's street food world. The person who fed more mouths per day than any restaurant, any institution, any market. The person who was in many ways the beating heart of working-class London itself. The costermonger. Coming up next, who they really were, how they lived, and why they had their own secret language that even the police could not decipher. So here we are, still on the street, still in the noise, the smoke, the cold, and now I want to introduce you to someone, not a king, not a politician, not anyone whose name appears in a history textbook. I want to introduce you to the person who actually ran Victorian London, or at least the version of it that most Londoners lived in, the costermonger. The word itself is wonderfully strange when you sit with it. Costermonger. It comes from two very old English words. Costard, a type of large, ribbed apple that was sold on the streets of medieval London, and monger, which simply means seller, or trader, so a costermonger was, in the most literal sense, an apple seller. But by the time Queen Victoria sat on the throne, the word had grown into something far bigger than apples. It described an entire tribe, an entire way of life, a community of people between 30,000 and 45,000 of them, by Henry Mayhew's careful count in the late 1840s, who bought food at the wholesale markets before dawn and sold it on the streets of London from first light until well after dark. 30 to 45,000 people, just in London, just doing this one thing. And Mayhew was quick to point out that this number was almost certainly an undercount, because when the government tried to conduct a census in 1841, the official tally came back with just over 2,000 hawkers and peddlers in the whole city. 2,000, which Mayhew described, with considerable understatement, as absurdly small. The reason for the discrepancy: not one costermonger in 20 had filled in their census form. Some could not read, some could not write, and almost all of them, and this I find deeply, perfectly human, were suspicious of what the government wanted the information for. These were people who had been regulated, fined, harassed, and moved along by authorities for generations. Why on earth would they tell those same authorities exactly how many of them there were? Let me paint you a picture of who these people actually were, because the image that tends to come to mind, a cheerful Cockney fellow pushing a barrow of apples and singing a happy tune, is only a very small part of the story. Yes, some costermongers were cheerful, some were genuinely prosperous, by the standards of their world, but the costermonger community was enormous and varied, and many of its members were living on an edge so thin it would make you hold your breath. Mayhew described them as comprising several very different groups. About half, roughly half, were what he called coster-born and bred. These were the children and grandchildren of costermongers. They had grown up on the streets, learned the trade from their parents, inherited their roots and their customers and their knowledge of which wholesale markets opened when, and which days the prices were best. These were the professionals, the ones who knew every trick. Girls in this group might start selling on the street as young as 6 years old, carrying watercress in a small basket before the sun came up, earning a few pennies that would go directly toward the family's food that day. Boys joined their fathers on the barrow at 7, and by 1313 many of them were running their own small operation independently. At 13 years old, some of these children were essentially self-employed small business owners. Think about that for a moment. But there was another group within the costermonger world that Mayhew described with something that reads almost like compassion. These were the newcomers, the people who had arrived at street selling not by choice, not by tradition, but by disaster, labourers who had lost their factory jobs, servants dismissed without a reference, mechanics whose workshops had closed, Irish families who had survived the Great Famine of the 1840s and fled to London with nothing but the clothes on their backs, and 2,000 Irish immigrants became costermongers in those years alone, Mayhew noted, picking up the trade because it was the one thing you could begin with almost no money at all. One coster said of these late arrivals, with an honesty that was almost brutal, "We pity them. It's just another way of starving." Because the truth was this: the street-selling trade looked, from the outside, like it was accessible to anyone, and in one sense it was. You could theoretically buy a small tray of produce at Covent Garden Market for a few shillings, and set yourself up as a costermonger by 9 in the morning. But the knowledge of where to stand, how to call, which products sold on which streets, which customers could be trusted, how to judge the quality of produce in the dark of an early morning market, that knowledge took years to learn, and without it, you were just a person standing on a corner holding a basket of vegetables, slowly losing your investment. Now here is where the costermongers become genuinely fascinating to me, because they were not just sellers. They were a society with their own rules, their own hierarchy, their own culture, and yes, their own language. I mentioned backslang earlier, and I want to spend a moment here because I think it is one of the most remarkable things about this community. Backslang was almost certainly invented in the 1830s or 40s by costermongers, possibly by a single unusually creative costermonger whose identity is now lost to history. The basic principle was elegant in its simplicity. You take an ordinary English word and say it backwards. Boy became yob. That word survives today in British English. By the way, as a term for a rough or troublesome youth, though most people who use it have no idea they are speaking Victorian street slang from nearly 200 years ago. Penny became yenep. Police became esclop, or more commonly just slop. So when a coster wanted to warn his companions that a constable was nearby, he would murmur cool slop, cool meaning look, slop meaning police, look, police, two words that meant nothing to anyone who did not know, and everything to everyone who did. Good became doog. A good day's trading, a profitable day, was a dugano. A bad day was a dabino. And there is something Mayhew noted that I find extraordinary, and that says something important about the nature of this community. Almost all costermongers were illiterate. They could not read, they could not write, and yet backslang, in its original form, was built on the written word. You had to know how a word was spelled in order to reverse it properly, which means that somewhere in the early decades of the 19th century, in the streets of the East End, some unusually literate person sat down and built a language for a community of people who could not read a language based entirely on reading. Mayhew met a coster in 1849 who freely admitted he was still consciously inventing new words and adding them to the vocabulary, making it richer, making it harder for outsiders to crack, because that was the whole point, not just to communicate, but to belong, and belonging the fierce, almost tribal sense of belonging that ran through the costermonger community. This was perhaps the most defining thing about them. They had their own dress code, and I want you to know that this was not casual. This was not simply a matter of wearing whatever was cheap or practical. This was identity. Costermonger men in the mid-Victorian era wore long waistcoats of sandy-coloured corduroy, fastened with buttons of polished brass or mother of pearl that caught the light. Their trousers were also corduroy, with distinctive bell-bottomed legs. Their boots were decorated, often with embroidered motifs of roses, hearts, and thistles. And then there was the neckerchief, called the kingsman, usually green silk, patterned with yellow flowers, or sometimes red and blue, tied with a particular knot, worn in a particular way. Mayhew was almost poetic about it. He wrote that a costermonger would sooner pawn everything he owned than pawn his kingsman. Only actual starvation, only the most desperate. Rock-bottom hunger would drive a coster to part with it, and when times improved, even slightly, the kingsman was always the first thing to be redeemed from the pawnshop. Before food, before tools, the silk neckerchief first, because the kingsman was not just a piece of clothing, it was a declaration. I am a costermonger. I belong here. I am someone. Have you ever held on to something like that? Something that felt like more than just an object. Something that felt like proof of who you are, even when everything else felt uncertain. I think that is a feeling that crosses every century. The costermonger's relationship with authority deserves its own chapter in some thick history book, because it is genuinely extraordinary. Their hostility toward the police was not just widespread, it was legendary, and it went far beyond the ordinary wariness that poor communities tend to develop around law enforcement. This was active, creative, organised resistance. When a constable impounded a costermonger's barrow, which happened frequently, since street selling often ran afoul of various laws about obstruction, the other costers in the area would sometimes rush in while the policeman went to get assistance. They would quickly remove the wheel from the confiscated barrow and hide it somewhere, so when the policeman returned with backup to cart the whole thing away, he would find a legless, immovable cart and absolutely no one willing to explain what had happened. One costermonger told Mayhew, with obvious satisfaction, that he had once put a policeman in the hospital and done 12 months in prison for it. And then he said, without any apparent regret, the 12 months had been worth it. Now, I am not in any way suggesting this was admirable behaviour, but I do think it tells you something important about the social temperature of Victorian London. These were people who'd been harassed, moved along, fined, and prosecuted for doing the only work available to them. People who had no vote, no representation, no one in Parliament who spoke for them or cared about their interests. And their response was to build a community so tight, so self-contained, so loyal internally even as it was rough and chaotic externally, that it functioned almost as a parallel society within the city. By the 1860s, the respected elder figures within the costermonger world were being elected as pearly kings and queens, a tradition that began as a way of settling disputes between rival sellers, keeping order within the community when no outside authority was trusted to do it fairly. The pearly kings and queens still exist today. By the way, you can still see them in London on ceremonial occasions, wearing jackets covered in thousands of mother-of-pearl buttons, the direct descendants of those brass and pearl buttons that the Victorian costers wore on their corduroy waistcoats. The tradition survived, the clothing changed, but the identity, that fierce, proud, decorated identity carried on. Let me tell you about a Saturday night in the New Cut. The New Cut was a street in Lambeth on the south side of the Thames, and on a Saturday night in the 1840s or 1850s, it was something that I suspect you would have to see to truly believe. Mayhew described it, and his description is one of the most vivid passages in all of his writing. He wrote, "Lit by a host of lights. The cut was packed from wall to wall. The hubbub was deafening, the traders all crying their wares with the full force of their lungs against the background din of a horde of street musicians. Wall to wall, deafening. Saturday night was when the workers got paid, which meant it was the busiest, most competitive, most electrifying time in the costermonger's week. They would start their morning 3, 4 in the morning at Covent Garden or Billingsgate or Spitalfields Market, pushing through the dark to get the best stock at the best price. They would spend the whole day on their routes, covering anywhere from 2 to 10 miles on foot, and then Saturday night was the payoff. The streets blazed with naphtha lamps. Produce was displayed in the best light possible. Voices went hoarse with crying. Boys were hired specifically because they could still shout after the men had lost their voices, and 2 or 3 boys yelling together made more noise than one tired adult, which was simply good business. One seller was recorded as crying, "Warm your hands and fill your bellies for a halfpenny. Half a penny for hot food, for warmth, for a moment of human comfort in the middle of a cold week." That sentence, in 6 words, tells you almost everything you need to know about what street food meant in Victorian London. And yet for all their energy, all their noise, all their pride and solidarity, the costermonger's daily life was defined by a precariousness that is genuinely difficult to imagine. 3 consecutive days of rain could bring them to the edge of hunger. Not metaphorical hunger, actual hunger, because rain meant fewer customers in the street. Fewer customers meant unsold stock, especially fruit and fish, spoiled overnight, and spoiled stock was money that had already been spent and could not be recovered. January and February were described, in the accounts of the time, as months of near famine for many costermonger families. The fish that might have saved them was sometimes too expensive at the wholesale markets in winter, and their motto, which Mayhew recorded, and which I find both heartbreaking and rather wonderful, was this: "Spend it while you've got it. Tomorrow you may die." Not recklessness, not irresponsibility, just a completely clear-eyed understanding of how uncertain tomorrow actually was. So who exactly was the costermonger feeding? Everyone, in a sense. The very poor, who could not afford anything more substantial. The working class, who depended on street food because they had no facilities to cook at home. And sometimes secretly, quietly, the people who considered themselves a step above all that, and who would never admit to buying from a barrow. But they bought from the barrow. They just waited until fewer people were watching. The costermonger fed the city 30 to 45,000 of them, moving through the streets like a vast, living supply chain, buying at dawn, selling by day, resting barely at all, starting again before most of the city had opened its eyes. They were not celebrated. They were not thanked. They were, more often than not, moved on, fined, and regarded with a mixture of affection and disdain by the classes above them. But without them, without those barrows and those hoarse voices and those green silk kingsmen catching the lamplight on a Saturday night, the city would simply not have been able to feed itself. Of course, now that we know who was selling, the question you've probably been quietly sitting with for a while is, what exactly were they selling? Because the costermonger sold fruit and vegetables. Yes, but the street food of Victorian London went so much further than that. There were sellers of things so strange, and things so oddly familiar, and things so quietly horrifying, that I think you are going to find the next part of this story genuinely surprising. We are going to start with pies, specifically the pie man, a figure so iconic, so beloved, and so genuinely alarming from a food safety standpoint that Charles Dickens felt the need to put him in his very first novel. What was in those pies? How were they made? And why did eating one carry a very real risk that even a hungry Victorian sometimes had to think carefully about? Right? Let us talk about pies. And I want you to know, before we begin, that I have spent a genuinely uncomfortable amount of time researching what went into a Victorian street pie, and I am going to share everything I found with you tonight, because I believe you deserve to know. Some of it is funny, some of it is rather alarming, and one part of it connects directly to one of the most enduring characters in all of Victorian storytelling, someone whose name, I suspect, you already know, but we will get there. First, the pieman himself. The pieman was one of the oldest figures in London street life. Not Victorian old, medieval old, Henry Mayhew, who documented almost everything worth knowing about the working poor of mid-19th century London, called the trade of the itinerant pie seller one of the most ancient of the street callings of London. There was even a nursery rhyme about it, one that most American children still learn, even now, without ever quite knowing where it came from. Simple Simon met a pieman. Going to the fair, says Simple Simon to the pieman, "Let me taste your ware." Says the pieman to Simple Simon, "Show me first your penny." Says Simple Simon to the pieman, "Indeed I have not any." That rhyme, in 4 lines, tells you almost everything you need to know about the relationship between hungry Londoners and the people who fed them. You wanted the pie. The pie was warm and hot and smelled wonderful, and the pieman wanted his penny. So what did a Victorian street pieman actually look like? Close your eyes for a moment and picture this. A man, usually a man, moving through a crowd in the early evening. When the pubs are beginning to fill and the workers are heading home from the docks and the factories, he carries a large tin box slung on a strap across his shoulders or strapped against his chest. Inside that tin box, nestled against a small charcoal burner at the bottom, are the pies, kept warm, or at least kept somewhat warm by the heat rising from below. He is crying as he goes. Pies all are eel, beef, or mutton pies, penny pies, all are, and he ducks into every pub, every tap room, every crowded doorway along his route, because that is where the real business is. The men who've been drinking since 5 in the evening, the workers who are tired and hungry and have just enough coins left in their pocket for one more thing before they go home. These are his best customers, and on a good night at Greenwich Fair in the summer, or a military review in Hyde Park, or a busy Saturday in any of London's working-class neighbourhoods, a pieman might sell enough pies to take home 5 or even 8 shillings. On a bad night, he told Mayhew, "I was out last night from 4 in the afternoon till 12:30, and I didn't take home 1 shilling and 6pence, 8 hours in the cold and the dark, for less than the price of a cup of coffee today." Now, I imagine you're sitting there, in the warmth, and you're wondering the question that I think is the most important question in this whole story. What was actually in the pie? This is where things get interesting. The official answer the answer the pieman would give you, with his best honest expression, was beef, or mutton, or eel, meat pies, fish pies, sometimes fruit pies in season, a penny for any one of them. The reality was considerably more complicated. Mayhew described the pastry of a street pie as having what he called a strong flavour, and he attributed this quality primarily to the use of rancid butter. Not fresh butter, rancid butter, because fresh butter cost money, and rancid butter was cheap, and if the crust of the pie was strongly enough flavoured, strongly enough seasoned, strongly enough masked, who was really going to know the difference in the dark of a tap room at 10 in the evening? The filling was, and Mayhew was careful here, I think, because he was a journalist and he understood the difference between what could be proven and what was merely suspected. The filling consisted of approximately half an ounce of meat per pie. Half an ounce. For context, that is roughly the weight of 2 large grapes. Per pierre. And the gravy, oh, the gravy deserves its own moment, because here is what Mayhew recorded, and I want you to really hear this. The gravy served with a Victorian meat pie was poured from a small oil can, and it consisted of, and I am quoting Mayhew directly here, a little salt and water browned. That was it. Coloured water, salted water, browned to look like gravy, poured through a small hole made in the top of the pie crust with the little finger. And Mayhew records with that perfectly neutral journalist tone that somehow makes everything worse, that with this gravy applied liberally, a person in the trade had known pies 4 days old go off very freely, and be pronounced excellent. 4 days old, no refrigeration, kept warm against a small charcoal burner, pronounced excellent. At this point, you may be wondering, what else was possibly in there? And this is where I have to tread carefully, because the full story sits at that uneasy junction between documented history and urban legend. But what I can tell you is that the anxiety about the contents of street pies was widespread enough that it entered the literature of the period. Charles Dickens and I will never tire of how much Dickens wrote about it in his very first novel, The Pickwick Papers, published in 1836 and 1837. His character Sam Weller, the Cockney servant, delivers what I consider one of the great deadpan lines in all of Victorian fiction. He advises his employer to buy a pie only, and I am quoting when you know the lady has made it, and is quite sure it ain't kitten. Kitten, Sam Weller elaborated, with a kind of cheerful horror, that a certain pieman of his acquaintance used cats for beefsteak, veal and kidney, according to the demand. Dickens returned to the theme 7 years later in Martin Chuzzlewit, where a character named Tom Pinch feels a wave of gratitude that his evil genius did not lead him into the dens of any of those preparers of cannibalic pastry, who are represented in many country legends as doing a lively retail business in the metropolis. Cannibalic pastry, doing a lively retail business. Now, was any of this actually true? Honestly, the historical evidence suggests that by Mayhew's time, the meat price had fallen enough that truly terrible substitutions were probably less common than the rumours suggested. Mayhew himself was careful to note that the old rumours about cat and dog were, by the 1850s, a vile slander, but the rumours existed. They circulated widely enough that Dickens put them in 2 separate novels, and the journalist Albert Smith, writing in the same era, called street pies in a phrase I find both hilarious and perfectly accurate covered uncertainties. Covered uncertainties. Think about that the next time you are not sure what is in something someone hands you. And then in the year 1846, when street pie anxiety was running at something close to its Victorian peak, a story appeared in a penny publication called The People's Periodical. It was published in serial form, 18 weekly parts, beginning in November of that year. The story was called The String of Pearls, and its main character was a barber named Sweeney Todd, the demon barber of Fleet Street, who murdered his customers in his barber's chair, sent their bodies through a trapdoor to the cellar below, and whose business partner, the notorious Mrs. Lovett, baked their flesh into meat pies and sold them to the very public that had, just a few months earlier, been alive and walking those same streets. The story was almost certainly fiction. Scholars have searched and found no reliable evidence of a real barber named Sweeney Todd operating on Fleet Street in the 18th century. But here is what is true, and what I think matters. The story was believable to the people who read it. It was believable because the anxiety about what was in a pie was real. It was believable because in a city of millions, with no food labelling, no regulations, no inspectors, and 100,000 street vendors selling things in the dark, anything felt possible. The fiction of Sweeney Todd grew directly out of the fact of the penny pie, and there is something slightly unnerving about that. Even now, let me step back from the darkness for a moment, though, because I think it is important, and I genuinely believe this to be fair to the PMN, the vast majority of them were not trying to harm anyone. They were, by and large, people who had fallen out of better paying work and found themselves in the only trade available to them. Mayhew found that many P-men were bakers by training men who had worked in proper bakeries, but lost their positions and had no other skill to sell. The business was hard, the margins were thin, and the competition was brutal. By the 1840s and 1850s, the P-man was increasingly fighting a losing battle against a new and formidable rival, the penny pie shop. Fixed premises, indoors, larger pies, warmer in winter, and crucially, and this is the detail that I think truly finished the street pieman, the pie shops had bands playing music and gas illuminations on the day they opened. One pieman told Mayhew, with what I imagine was a mixture of bitterness and grudging admiration, there was a band of music and an illumination at the pie shop, and it was impossible to stand against that. The first recorded pie and mash shop opened in 1844 at 101 Union Street in Suffolk. Its founder was a man named Henry Blanchard. He sold both eel and meat pies at a penny each, added freshly mashed potatoes, added a sauce made from eel stock and parsley that became known simply as liquor, and suddenly offered the working classes of London something that felt almost, and I want to choose this word carefully, dignified. You could sit down at a marble table with tiled walls around you and eat a proper meal, not standing in the rain outside a pub, not grabbing something out of a tin box in the dark, but sitting down at a table like a person who had a place in the world. By 1874, there were 33 pie and mash shops listed in London, and the lonely street pie man, wandering through the late-night crowd with his dying charcoal and his oil can of coloured water, was slowly, steadily becoming a figure of the past. But before we leave him entirely, I want to tell you about one last thing the pieman gave Victorian London. Something small, something irreverent, something so perfectly human that I have been thinking about it ever since I first read Mayhew's account of it. The toss. Tossing the pieman. Here is how it worked. A customer approaches. The pieman holds out a pie. Instead of simply paying his penny, the customer proposes a wager. They flip a coin if the customer calls it correctly. He gets the pie for free and keeps his penny. If he calls it wrong, he pays the penny, and the pieman keeps the pie as well. The customer loses both his money and his dinner. And there is no polite way to put this, gambling. Street gambling. The Marylebone magistrate who sentenced a pieman for it in 1829 called it, with the magnificent pomposity that only a Victorian magistrate could muster, evidence that as soon as children came out of their petticoats, they were taught gambling, which was the first step to thieving. The pieman in question had stolen the hat of a deaf and dumb boy he found asleep on London Bridge, which does somewhat undermine his credibility as a moral exemplar. Yes, but the toss itself, the toss was everywhere. Mayhew interviewed a pieman who told him very few people buy without tossing, and the boys in particular, gentlemen out on the spree at the late public houses, will frequently toss when they don't want the pies, and when they have won they will amuse themselves by throwing the pies at one another, or at me, at the pieman, rich men out drinking, winning free pies and then throwing them at the person who had baked them. And here is the line that stopped me cold when I first read it. The same pieman continued, "Sometimes I've taken as much as half a crown, and the people of whom I had the money has never eaten a pie. 1/2 crown, good money for a pieman, all of it won at the toss, from men who are too drunk or too entertained to care about the food. And so there it is, the penny pie, invented by necessity, sustained by hunger, haunted by rumour, killed by progress, and right up until the very end, kept alive by a coin flip and the eternal human love of a small wager. There is a kind of melancholy in the disappearance of the peaman, not because the food was better, it wasn't, not because the conditions were safer, they absolutely were not, but because with him went a certain kind of intimacy, the transaction between a hungry person and another hungry person who had baked something with their own hands and carried it through the dark to reach you. That exchange was rough. It was imperfect. It was sometimes actually quite frightening from a food safety perspective, but it was human. And when the lit-up pie shops with their marble tables and their parsley sauce replaced it, something was gained: warmth, reliability, a seat at a table and something quiet, something unruly, something that smelled of charcoal and cold air and rancid butter, was lost. Now, speaking of things that lived and died in the Thames water, there is another character waiting for us in this story, one that is, in many ways, even stranger than the pie man, because while the pie man at least dealt in creatures most of us would recognise as food, even if we had questions about their precise identity, the next great staple of Victorian street life came from the river itself, slippery, ancient, practically indestructible, and prepared in ways that would either delight you or send you immediately to bed without finishing this episode. We're going to talk about eels. Eels. Just saying the word out loud does something to people. Some of you, right now, are quietly intrigued. Some of you are already making a face. And some of you, and I respect this deeply, have already pulled the blanket a little higher, as if fabric is a defence against what is coming. But I want you to stay with me on this one, because the story of eels in Victorian London is not just a story about a strange food that working-class people ate out of desperation. It is something much more interesting than that. It is a story about resilience, both the remarkable resilience of the eel itself and the quiet, stubborn resilience of the communities that depended on it, and it ends, as so many London stories do, with something surprising. Let us begin with the creature. The European eel anguilla is its scientific name, and I love that it sounds like something from a bad dream is, biologically speaking, one of the most extraordinary animals that has ever shared the planet with us. It spends most of its life in fresh water, rivers, streams, the mudflats and tidal edges of estuaries, but it is born in salt water, specifically in an area of the North Atlantic called the Sargasso Sea, somewhere between the Bahamas and the Azores, thousands of miles from England. The young eels drift on ocean currents for years, slowly making their way north and east across the Atlantic until they reach the rivers of Europe. They can cross wet grass to reach an isolated pond. They can survive in a tiny puddle of water for hours, and unlike almost every other fish, they can be kept alive out of the water on a wet cloth, in a bucket, on the floor of a market stall, which made them uniquely practical for street food at a time when refrigeration did not exist. This is not a small thing. In a city where most fish had to be salted or smoked the moment it left the water, because it would otherwise spoil before it could be sold, the eel arrived alive. It could stay alive. It could be killed moments before it was eaten, and it was everywhere. For centuries we are talking medieval times. Not just Victorian times, the Thames was thick with eels. Medieval Londoners set basket traps called eel bucks in the river in such numbers, and pulled out such quantities that at one point eel bucks were mentioned in the Magna Carta. The Magna Carta, the great charter of English liberties, signed in 1215, one of its clauses specifically prohibited eel bucks from being set in the Thames and its tributaries in ways that obstructed river navigation. They were such a nuisance to river traffic that a king had to write a law about them. Think about that for a moment. Imagine the Thames so full of eel trappers that it became a navigational hazard. For centuries, rents were sometimes paid in eel pies rather than money. Ely Cathedral, whose very name is believed by some scholars to derive from an old word for eel, was partly built on the revenues from the eel fisheries of the surrounding fens. This was a food of such deep, ancient significance to English life that it predates almost everything else we associate with British cuisine. By the time Victoria came to the throne in 1837, though something had changed. The Thames was dying, slowly, inexorably, under the weight of a city growing faster than any city had ever grown before the river was becoming something that no living creature, eel or otherwise, could easily survive in: industrial effluent, human waste, the outflow from tanneries, dye works, slaughterhouses, gasworks, all of it pouring directly into the water. The great stink of 1858, when the summer heat turned the Thames into something so foul that members of Parliament had to hang curtains soaked in chloride of lime on the windows of the Houses of Parliament just to sit in their chamber. That was the moment the country finally admitted what had been happening to the river for decades. By then, the native eel population of the Thames had been severely depleted. Here is where the story takes an unexpected turn, because the eel trade did not collapse. It expanded. As it turned out, the Dutch had been bringing eels to London in their fishing barges since at least 1472, when they were granted trading rights by King Edward, and after the Great Fire of London in 1666, when the city was devastated and needed feeding. The Dutch eel boats had helped keep Londoners alive during the Reconstruction, as thanks. And this is one of those small historical details that I find completely wonderful. The Dutch eel fishermen were granted exclusive rights in 1699 to sell eels from their barges moored on the Thames. Exclusive rights, a monopoly on eel delivery to London, as a thank you for fish. So as the native Thames eel population collapsed under Victorian pollution, the Dutch barges simply moved further upstream to keep their cargo alive in cleaner water, and the supply continued. Up to 500 eel sellers operated at Billingsgate Market at the height of the Victorian eel trade. 500 stalls, all selling the same thing. The Reverend David Badham, writing in 1854, captured the moment vividly. He wrote, "London steams and teems with eels alive and stewed. For 1/2 penny, a man of the million may fill his stomach with 6 or 7 long pieces, and wash them down with a sip of the glutinous liquid they are stewed in. 1/2 penny for 6 or 7 pieces of hot, stewed eel," when Mayhew recorded one seller calling out "warm your hands and fill your bellies for a 1/2 penny. He was not using poetic license. He was quoting a real man, in a real street, offering real food at a price that was accessible to almost anyone who had any money at all. Now I realize I need to pause here and address something, because I suspect a significant portion of you are currently thinking, eels are fine. I understand they were cheap and available and nutritious, but what did they actually taste like? And the honest answer, from everyone who has described them, from Victorian social reporters to modern food writers who have tracked down the surviving pie shops and eaten their way through the menu, is this: surprisingly good. Mild, slightly sweet, described by one modern eater as being nothing like you expect, not strongly fishy, not slimy in the mouth but delicate, like a very good freshwater fish cooked simply and well. The texture, served hot and stewed, is tender, and served cold, in the jellied form, well, that is where it gets more challenging. Let me explain what jellied eels actually are, because I think the name does them a disservice. Jellied eels were made by chopping the eel into round, small cylindrical pieces, about 1 inch long, and boiling them in water with vinegar, nutmeg, lemon juice, and sometimes peppercorns or bay leaves. The important thing about eels, biologically, is that their bones and skin release enormous quantities of natural collagen when cooked. Collagen is the same substance that makes a good chicken stock set firm when it cools, so as the eel boiled, it released its own natural gelatin into the cooking liquid, and when that liquid cooled without any artificial setting agents, without anything added, it became a firm, glossy, translucent jelly The eel pieces sat suspended in this jelly like little fossils in amber, and the whole thing was served cold, sometimes from a tin cup, sometimes on a shallow dish, doused with malt vinegar and sometimes a pinch of white pepper. When a boy in 1884 was asked what he would most like to eat, he replied, and I find this charming in a very specific Victorian way, "Well, I'd start with a cup of eels, a halfpenny hot, but cold, a penny, because then it's fixed stiff, a penny, because the cold, set version, the jellied version, required more time to prepare, more skill, more patience, and so it cost twice as much." The child's logic was impeccable. There is a question I keep coming back to when I think about the eel trade, and it is this: why did a food that was essentially a product of poverty, cheap, abundant, requiring no real skill to prepare, end up becoming something with such deep emotional meaning for the communities that ate it? Because it did, it is not a stretch to say that for many working-class families in the East End of London, eels were not just nutrition, they were home. The smell of hot eel stew from a street cart on a winter evening, the specific texture of the cold jelly against the side of a tin cup, the sharp hit of malt vinegar cutting through the richness of the broth. These were the sensory memories of childhood for generations of Londoners, and when the street sellers were eventually replaced as the pie shops with their marble tables and their tiled walls took over, the eels went with them, into the shops, into the same menu, part of the same ritual. The three families who came to define Victorian and Edwardian eel culture in London are worth a moment of our time, because they are also, in their own way, a story about immigration and identity that is quite beautiful. The first is the Cook family. Frederick Cook opened what is considered the first true eel pie and mash shop in Clerkenwell in 1862. He called it, without any false modesty, the poor man's delicacy. He was, from his name, of Irish descent. The second family is the Manzas. Michel Manze arrived in London from a small village called Ravello in southern Italy in 1878. He was 3 years old. His family, like many Italian immigrants of the period, began by selling ice cream on the streets. Eventually, Michel bought a shop from the Cook family and began selling eels with pie and mash instead. His grandson runs the oldest surviving pie and mash shop in London today on Tower Bridge Road, which opened in 1902 and has been serving the same food in the same building ever since. The third family, the Kellys, arrived from Ireland somewhat later. George Kelly opened his shop on Roman Road Market in 1937, but became known to many as the finest of the three. An Irish family, an Italian family, an English working-class family, all building their livelihoods around a river creature that had once fed the medieval city and was now feeding the industrial one. That is not just the story of eel pie. That is the story of London itself. At the peak of the eel shop trade, at the end of the 19th century, there were over 110 eel pie and mash shops in London. Over 110. And at that peak, this is the detail that stops me every time I read it at the peak. A busy shop might consume 2 tons of live eels per week. 2 tons. Think about that weight. Think about the number of Dutch fishing barges needed to supply it. Think about the number of people eating it. The eel was not a curiosity. It was not a novelty. It was the foundation of an entire culinary culture that fed millions of people across multiple generations. There is one more thing I want to tell you about eels before we move on. Something that happened long after the Victorian era, and that I find genuinely moving. Since 1980, the population of the European eel has declined by 95%. 95% gone from the Thames, from the rivers, from the eel traps and the market stalls and the buckets outside the pie shops. In 2005, researchers counted 1,500 eels in the Thames. By 2010, that number had fallen to 50 eels in the entire river. In 2024, only 34 eel and pie shops remained in all of London. Some of them no longer cook the eels themselves. Some serve eel that comes pre-prepared from Holland. exactly as it did in the 17th century, and on the streets where the eel sellers once cried all out into the fog there is silence. The creature that fed medieval kings and Victorian dock workers and the children of Irish immigrants is now on the critically endangered list, and I find myself wondering whether future generations will know what we lost, not just the food, but the world that was built around it, the cold winter evening, the tin cup, the penny, the jelly, the smell of malt vinegar in the dark. I mentioned earlier that all of Victorian London's great street food stories involve a tension between what was available and what was wanted, between survival and pleasure, between the city's hunger and its means of feeding itself. The Eels were perhaps the purest expression of that tension, ancient and unpretentious, cheap and nourishing, loved by people who had very little else to love about their circumstances. But every story of Victorian street food also has its other side, its softer, sweeter, more gentle side. And the next chapter of tonight's story belongs to the morning, specifically to a very particular sound that would float down the streets of Victorian London as the day was just beginning. A bell, small, clear, slightly apologetic in tone, and the man who rang it carried something warm under a cloth on a tray on his head, something that smelled of yeast and butter, and the promise that the day had not yet gone wrong. The Muffin Man. The morning belonged to a different kind of sound entirely, not the rough, competitive shouting of the Saturday night market, not the hoarse cry of the eel seller or the pieman's late-night appeal to the taproom crowd. No, the morning had something gentler. A bell, small, clear, slightly insistent, moving slowly down a quiet residential street just as the winter light was beginning, very tentatively, to suggest that day was coming, and every child in London who heard that bell knew exactly what it meant. The Muffin Man. Before we go any further, I want to make sure we're all imagining the right thing, because if you are picturing the large, domed, sweetened American muffin, the kind that fills a paper cup and has blueberries in it and costs $4 in a coffee shop, please gently set that image aside. The Victorian muffin was something quite different. It was a small, flat, round piece of bread made with yeast, cooked on a griddle, pale and soft on top with a slightly darker crust at the bottom, about the size of your palm, chewy inside, designed to be split, toasted on a fork over a fire, and eaten with as much butter as you could reasonably justify. Not a cake, not a dessert, a bread, the kind of bread that, on a cold morning, with a thick smear of butter melting into all the little air pockets inside, could make the entire miserable prospect of the day ahead feel briefly, beautifully manageable. Henry Mayhew counted approximately 500 muffin sellers working the streets of London during the winter months in the 1850s. 500. And this was specifically a winter trade. The Muffin Man appeared in the cold months October through to March, roughly, and disappeared when the weather turned warm. Because the whole appeal of the muffin was heat, warmth, the promise that something toastable and buttery was within arm's reach on a morning when the windows were frosted over and no one wanted to leave the house. The sellers bought their muffins from bakers. They almost never made them themselves, typically getting 13 muffins for the price of 12 as a courtesy discount from bakers who knew them. They wrapped the muffins in thick flannel cloth inside a wooden tray, which the seller carried balanced on top of their head. Yes, on their head. Tray, flannel, muffins, and all. As they walked, they rang the handbell, not violently, not desperately, the way the pieman sometimes went, but steadily, rhythmically, with a kind of confident patience, because the Muffin Man did not need to shout. The bell was enough. The bell spoke for itself. One old muffin seller told Mayhew, in a line I find completely charming, "People likes them warm, sir. To satisfy them they're fresh, and they almost always are fresh. But it can't matter so much about their being warm, as they have to be toasted again. I only wish good butter was a sight cheaper, and that would make the muffins go. Butter's half the battle. Butter's half the battle. I want that embroidered on a pillow." Now here is where things get unexpectedly political, because the muffin bell, that innocent tinkling sound of a cold morning, was apparently so irritating to certain people that by 1839, British Parliament had passed a bill to prohibit it. Parliament debating muffin bells, because apparently a vocal minority of Londoners found the sound so deeply objectionable that they lobbied their elected representatives until someone took action. A writer in 1832 confessed, with what reads as genuine distress, "Muffin bells are also my aversion. I scarcely know why, but from my very childhood I've had a horror of the muffin man's bell. Now I find this wonderful. The city was full of genuine suffering poverty, disease, overcrowding, open sewers, and somebody was lying awake at night troubled by the sound of a muffin bell. The ban, predictably, was almost entirely ignored. The muffin men kept ringing. The police occasionally dragged one to court. The bell rang on, and as one writer of the period observed, with the resigned tone of someone who has accepted that this particular battle is lost, the prohibition was not adhered to by sellers, a masterpiece of Victorian understatement, but the person who truly, permanently captured the muffin man for history was, as it so often was, Charles Dickens. In his 1838 novel Nicholas Nickleby, Dickens introduces a satirical subplot that I think is one of the funniest things he ever wrote. A group of scheming businessmen led by the villainous Ralph Nickleby convene a public meeting to launch a new company. The name of this company is the United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. I want you to appreciate that name for a moment. The United Metropolitan Improved Hot Muffin and Crumpet Baking and Punctual Delivery Company. Capital: £5 million, 500,000 shares at £10 each, all to be raised on the commercial prospects of selling muffins. Dickens had one of his characters declare, with total sincerity, that the company would confer undying brightness and splendour upon England, and another character, an Irish Member of Parliament, in the novel rose to say that he hoped to one day see crumpets toasted in Ireland's lowly cabins, and muffin bells ringing in her rich green valleys. The whole sequence is a razor-sharp satire of Victorian corporate greed, dressed up in the most absurd possible clothing. But what makes it work, what makes it land, is that the muffin itself was so ordinary, so domestic, so thoroughly associated with comfort and home, that using it as the vehicle for grand financial swindle was inherently, perfectly ridiculous. The muffin was the sound of morning, the sound of things being okay, and Dickens knew exactly what he was doing when he put it at the centre of a story about people who were very much not okay. While the muffin man was the sound of morning in the residential streets, there was another institution that defined the very earliest hours of the Victorian day one that served a different kind of customer entirely. The coffee stall. And I want to spend a moment here, because the coffee stall of Victorian London is one of those things that I think our modern world has genuinely lost, and I feel the loss more than I perhaps should. Picture this. It is 4:30 in the morning, still dark, bitterly cold, the kind of cold that gets into your coat and stays there. And at the corner of a main road near a market, near a railway terminus, near any point where the working world began, its day before the rest of the city was awake, there is a light, a small charcoal burner glowing underneath a large urn of coffee, a table, sometimes just a board laid across two sawhorses covered with tin mugs, a jug of milk, a bowl of sugar, perhaps some slices of bread and butter, wrapped in cloth, maybe a piece of currant cake, or a hard-boiled egg, or a handful of watercress, and standing behind it all, often a woman. The coffee stalls of Victorian London were, notably, a trade dominated by women, which in itself says something interesting about the economics of street selling, and who was willing to be out in the cold at 4 in the morning. One working man of the period described the experience of finding a coffee stall before dawn in terms that I find genuinely moving. He wrote, "The gleam from the hot coffee stall comes like a guiding star here. You get warmth to your hands on the outside of the cup, and for the inner man from the liquid, which you get piping hot, for the proprietors of the stalls are aware that that quality is regarded by their morning customers before strength or sweetness, warmth to your hands on the outside of the cup, and for the inner man from the liquid. I have read that sentence probably a dozen times since I first found it, and it still does something to me every time. Who came to the coffee stall? Everyone. Essentially, police constables finishing their night beats, cab drivers who'd been out since midnight, market workers heading in before dawn, dockhands and factory workers on early shifts, office clerks on their way into the city, and occasionally this is documented the homeless, the lost, the people who had nowhere else to go in the dark hours before the city woke up. Dickens himself described wandering the streets of London at night during a period of insomnia and finding his way, eventually, to a coffee stall near Covent Garden. He wrote about a man who came into the same stall with a cold meat pudding stuffed inside his hat, which he pulled out and ate with apparently complete composure, and the drowsy, half-asleep man behind the counter who kept nodding off between servings and then jolting back awake. And Dickens, standing there with his cup of coffee at 4 a.m, watching all of this, felt something that I recognise completely. The strange, quiet solidarity of being awake when most of the world is asleep. The coffee stall was one of the few places in Victorian London where social class, for the length of time it took to drink a hot cup, essentially dissolved. The constable and the cabman and the market girl stood at the same table. They put their hands around the same kind of cup. They were all just cold and tired and grateful for the warmth. A cup of coffee and two thin slices of bread and butter cost roughly half a penny at a basic stall. Half a penny. A better stall, with a proper urn and a selection of food, might charge a penny for coffee and provide bread and butter, cake, hard-boiled eggs, and ham sandwiches. But here is a detail that I find fascinating, and that says something quite important about the social dynamics of Victorian London. The coffee stalls attracted a slightly higher class of street customer than most other food vendors, because coffee was, in this period, not entirely a working-class drink. Tea had become the drink of the poor by the mid-Victorian era, cheap, easily made, requiring nothing but hot water and a pinch of dried leaves. But coffee was still associated with something slightly more elevated, and so the coffee stall drew the constable and the clerk alongside the dockhand. It was also, historians note, one of the safer options for liquid refreshment, because boiling the water to make the coffee killed the bacteria that made London's tap water so dangerous. In a city where clean water was a genuine luxury, a hot cup of boiled liquid was, in the most literal possible sense, safer than the alternative. Some stalls even served a cheaper version of coffee made with coffee, dried carrot, and chicory for customers who could not afford the real thing. Dried carrot in their coffee. Do I recommend it? I genuinely do not know, but I am willing to bet it was warm. Now, I mentioned oysters earlier briefly, in passing, and I realise I need to come back to them, because there is a piece of this story that is one of the great inversions of culinary history, and it deserves its own moment. In Victorian London, oysters were the food of the poor, not a luxury, not a delicacy reserved for restaurants with white tablecloths. The food of the poor. Sam Weller. Dickens' perpetual Cockney voice of common sense in the Pickwick Papers said it plainly. Poverty and oysters always seemed to go together. In the early and mid-Victorian era, oysters were so cheap and so abundant along the Thames estuary and the coastal waters around London that they were sold from street barrows for a penny a dozen. A penny for 12 oysters. They were the working-class protein of choice, quick to eat. No cooking required. Sold by the basketful from women who worked the street corners of the East End and the areas near the docks. They were so common that Roman archaeological digs in the city of London, the area that was once the Roman settlement of Londinium, almost always turn up enormous quantities of oyster shells, because in Roman times, too, oysters were the cheap food of ordinary people, 2,000 years of eating oysters by the Thames. And here is what happened. As the Victorian era progressed, as the Thames grew more and more polluted, as the estuary changed, as overfishing took its toll, oysters became scarce, and something that had been abundant and cheap became rare and expensive. By the end of the 19th century, the oyster that had fed Roman soldiers and Victorian dockhands alike had begun its slow migration up the social ladder, into restaurants, onto menus in the West End, away from the street barrow and the penny a dozen price. By the early 20th century, the oyster had completed its transformation from poor man's food to luxury item, from the barrow girl to the white tablecloth, from the pocket of a dockhand to the plate of someone who would never in their life stand on a street corner in the rain and eat. I find something genuinely melancholy in this. Not because oysters do not belong on fancy menus, they are wonderful, wherever they are eaten, but because something that had nourished the poorest people of the city for centuries, something democratic and immediate and utterly without pretension, was quietly taken away from the people who had depended on it, replaced by what? Watercress, pickled whelks, things that were still available, still cheap, still sold from the same kinds of barrows, by the same kinds of people, but not quite the same, never quite the same as a dozen oysters for a penny on a cold afternoon, eaten standing up, tasting of the sea. What strikes me, sitting with all of this, is the rhythm of the Victorian street food day. It was not random, it was not chaotic, even though it looked chaotic from the outside. It had a structure as precise as a clock, the coffee stall before dawn, for the people who began their day while the city still slept, the milkmaids and watercress girls in the early morning, moving through the residential streets while the households were just waking, the costermongers and the pea-men through the morning and afternoon, feeding the markets and the workshops and the docks, the muffin man in the late afternoon, his bell signalling the approach of evening, the eel sellers and the whelk stands opening as the pubs began to fill, and late at night, sometimes past midnight, the coffee stalls again, for the people coming out of the theatres, or the workers finishing their shifts, or simply the lost and the cold, looking for one last warm thing before the long walk home. The city fed itself from before sunrise to well after midnight. 6,000 vendors, millions of pennies. A whole civilization built on the simple, urgent, beautiful necessity of hunger. And speaking of hunger, and speaking of the way that hunger and desperation and creativity combine to produce things that last far longer than the circumstances that created them, the next part of our story takes us somewhere quite specific, to a night market blazing with naphtha lamps, to prices dropping by the minute as the hour grows late, to the butcher in his striped apron, holding meat up under the lights, and to what the people of Victorian London called with a kind of dark cheerfulness that I find completely characteristic being at the murder. There is a phrase that I have been turning over in my mind since I first encountered it. In the historical record, a phrase so perfectly working class, so darkly cheerful, so entirely of its time and place that I find it impossible not to love. Being at the murder. That was what they called it. The moment late on a Saturday night when a butcher, standing behind his stall in the lamplight, began slashing his prices to the bone to get rid of perishable stock before midnight, murdering his prices, and the women who had been waiting patiently, deliberately, knowingly for exactly that moment, would press forward out of the crowd with their market baskets, and the negotiating would begin. This is the world we're stepping into now. The Saturday night market of Victorian London, which was, in my honest opinion, one of the most extraordinary human spectacles that city ever produced. You have to understand the timing of it. Working-class Londoners were paid at the end of their working week, Saturday afternoon, sometimes Saturday evening, sometimes, and this is where things got complicated, Saturday night at the pub, because some employers paid their workers in the public house, which meant that by the time the wife arrived to collect the wages, a portion of the money had already gone into a pint glass beside the warm taproom fire. Mayhew documented this with the quiet precision of someone who had seen the consequences too many times to be surprised by it anymore. He wrote that many a working-class family sent their wives to collect the husband's wages on a Saturday evening, only to find the hours had flown pleasantly enough beside the fire, and a large portion of what they needed for the week had already been spent, and so the Sunday market opening on Sunday morning before church was not a luxury. It was not a pleasant outing. It was the last chance to buy Sunday dinner. For many families, it was that simple and that urgent, but the Saturday night market itself, the one that preceded the desperate Sunday morning version, that was something altogether different. That was theatre, that was festival, that was, in all honesty, one of the great free entertainments available to working-class Londoners in the second half of the 19th century. In 1851, Henry Mayhew counted 37 street markets operating in London. By 1893, a survey by the London County Council found 112 markets, with nearly 5,000 stalls, and the largest of all the ones that on a busy Saturday night drew crowds so dense that, as Mayhew put it, no vehicle dreams of passing were concentrated in the poorest, most working-class parts of the city: the New Cut in Lambeth, the Brill in Somers Town, Petticoat Lane in Whitechapel, Watney Street, Crisp Street, Berwick Street, names that meant almost nothing to the wealthy residents of the West End, and everything to the people who lived near them. Let me describe the New Cut on a Saturday night in November of 1849, because Mayhew was there, counting. He went on a Saturday evening and stayed from 8 until 10, and what he recorded reads like a kind of wild, improbable, magnificent inventory of a civilization feeding itself. Along the north side of the road, in a line stretching nearly half a mile, there were 300 stalls, not people wandering with baskets, stalls, 77 selling vegetables, 40 selling fruit, 25 selling fish, 22 selling boots and shoes, 14 selling cooked food, hot eels, baked potatoes, pies, boiled whelks, 10 selling nightcaps, lacy, artificial flowers, 10 more selling tinware saucepans, tea kettles, 9 selling crockery and glass, and then scattered among all of this the rest: brooms and brushes, poultry and rabbits, books, songs, almanacs, toys, chickweed and watercress, peep shows, pig's cheeks, peep shows. On a Saturday night, in the middle of a food market, someone had set up a peep show, because of course they had, because the Victorian Saturday night market was not just a place to buy your Sunday dinner, it was the closest thing most working-class Londoners had to a night out. And the light, I want to talk about the light, because Mayhew described it with a poetry that I find quite stunning. He wrote that every stall had its 1 or 2 lights. Some were illuminated by the intense white light of the new self-generating gas lamp, others by the red, smoky flame of the old grease lamp. One man showed off his yellow haddock with a candle stuck in a bundle of firewood. His neighbour made a candlestick of a huge turnip, and let the tallow gutter down its sides. Some stalls were crimson with the fire showing through the holes in a baked chestnut stove. Others had a candle shining through a sieve. And in the 1890s, the explorer Charles Booth described the whole scene blazing with naphtha lamps, the naked flame lamps that produced such an intense, almost aggressive brightness that they turned the winter street into something approaching theatrical lighting. Booth wrote, "The people crowd the streets, along which no vehicle dreams of passing, chatting with each other, haggling with the sellers, buying what they want or looking on while others buy. The air is bright with flaring lights and resonant with voices, bright with flaring lights, resonant with voices. Imagine standing at the edge of that, a half-mile strip of shouting, colour, flame, and human noise, on a dark November evening, the smell of hot chestnuts and fish and wet wool and coal smoke and something frying somewhere, the sound of 100 voices all claiming that what they have is the best thing available at the price they're offering, and moving through all of it the housewife with her market basket, the children darting between legs, the old women pausing to finger the meat, and somewhere in the crowd, the patience of the clever shopper, waiting. Because here is the thing about Saturday night market shopping that took genuine skill. You did not arrive early, not if you knew what you were doing. The savvy shopper Mayhew described her repeatedly, always with a kind of respectful admiration, arrived late. She walked the stalls slowly, noting prices, noting what was left, watching the seller's body language, because as the night went on, something happened to the price of perishable goods, fish, meat, vegetables that would not keep until Monday. These things had to be sold by midnight, or they were worthless, and the sellers knew it, and the buyers knew the sellers knew it, and the sellers knew the buyers knew they knew, and so a very particular dance began. The trade union leader Jack Dash, writing his memoirs decades later, described what he had witnessed as a child in the East End markets. His description is so vivid, so specific, that I want you to hear it almost exactly as he wrote it. He said, about 9:15, people would be waiting for the perishable food to be auctioned off, women in black shawls surrounding the butcher in his striped apron, holding up the meat under kerosene lamps. And then he added the phrase that I've not been able to stop thinking about since the first time I read it. The stallholders called it being at the murder, murdering their prices. At the murder, women in black shawls gathered around the butcher in the lamplight, waiting for him to start cutting the price of Sunday's dinner. There is something almost cinematic about that image, isn't there? And something quietly heartbreaking. Too, these were not women with options. These were women who had spent the whole evening on their feet, waiting for the exact moment when necessity and market forces would align, when hunger and the simple fact of midnight converging would make a joint of meat affordable. They were patient, they were strategic, and they knew exactly what they were doing. I think about this sometimes when I am standing in a modern supermarket, deciding between two cuts of meat that differ in price by $1.50. The stakes for me are, very genuinely, nothing for those women in black shawls, waiting under the kerosene lamps. The stakes were whether their children would have a proper meal on Sunday, and they were managing those stakes with complete competence, using every tool available to them: timing, patience, knowledge of the market, a refusal to be rushed. That is not desperation, that is expertise. I mentioned that the Saturday night market was also entertainment, and I want to be specific about this, because it was not entertainment in a passive sense. It was not simply a pleasant backdrop to the shopping. By the 1880s, the stalls were interspersed with other attractions entirely: street musicians, singers, performers, and the stallholders themselves, the people who cried the goods, had developed their sales patter into something approaching a form of street theatre that was, by all accounts, genuinely funny. Thomas Burke, writing about the East End markets in the early 20th century, described the sellers as wonderful fellows. Many of them, I imagined, decayed music hall men, people who had the timing and the wit of professional comedians, deployed entirely in the service of selling one more piece of meat before midnight. He described a scene that still reads like a comedy routine even now, the sellers calling out to passers-by, making jokes at their own expense, making jokes at the expense of the goods, making jokes at the expense of the prices they were forced to charge. Burke wrote of one man shouting, "I'll take any price you like, any price you like. Come along, me. This is the shop that does the business. Buy, buy, buy." And immediately after that, he described someone else on the other side of the same street trying to outshout the first man, raising the volume, raising the comedy, raising the sheer desperate energy of the whole performance. The Jewish traders of Petticoat Lane were particularly famous for this. Their wit was specifically celebrated. Visitors, middle-class observers who came to the East End markets as a kind of anthropological tourism, which was a very Victorian thing to do, recorded coming away having been amused despite themselves, having laughed at jokes they had not expected, having bought things they had not intended to buy. This was commerce, but it was also something else. It was community, and the line between the two was, on a Saturday night in the New Cut, essentially invisible. Now I want to share one more detail about the Saturday night market that I find both funny and somehow very touching. The question of authority, because the London street markets operated in an almost entirely unregulated space. No one gave the sellers permission to be there. No one collected rent for their pitches. In 1893, when a costermonger named John Denton of Chapel Street Market was questioned by a royal commission about whether any authority gave him leave to take up his particular spot, he simply answered, "No." The commission asked, "Did he pay any fee for the pitch?" "No." "Did he have any right to its ongoing occupation?" "No." And then, and this is the line I love most, he added, "as long as we keep the place clean, and there are no rows, nobody interferes with us. Nobody interferes with us. In other words, we exist because we are useful, and as long as we are orderly about it, the city leaves us alone." That was the entire legal basis of the Victorian street market. Usefulness and relative quiet. It is, in its own way, a kind of genius. By the 1890s, Mayhew's 37 markets had become 112. The city had grown. The number of working-class families who depended on the market had grown with it, and the market had adapted, expanded, diversified, absorbed immigrants from Ireland and Eastern Europe and beyond, welcomed them as sellers and buyers and street comedians, and continued to feed the city with a rough, cheerful, brilliant efficiency that no formal institution had ever quite managed to replicate. I mentioned a few moments ago that the Saturday night market was, for many working-class Londoners, the closest thing they had to a night out, but that is not quite complete, because there was one more form of entertainment available to them on those evenings, one that is, in some ways, the most unexpected chapter in this whole story. Something cold, something sweet, something that arrived in Victorian London on the backs of Italian immigrants, was sold from a small glass vessel on a street corner, and turned out to be quite literally a public health crisis in a cup. The penny lick, and the ice cream wars that nobody taught you about in school. Of all the stories woven through the streets of Victorian London, the one I find most unexpectedly delightful and most unexpectedly alarming is the story of ice cream. Not because ice cream is dramatic in itself, but because what happened to it in the second half of the 19th century is genuinely one of the more remarkable collisions between pleasure and public health that history has to offer. And it begins as so many good stories begin with an immigrant, a penny, and a very small glass. His name was Carlo Gatti. He was born in 1817 in Ticino, an Italian-speaking region of Switzerland, and he arrived in London in 1847 with what can only be described as an extraordinarily good eye for a business opportunity. He was 30 years old. He spoke Italian. He settled in Clerkenwell, in the neighbourhood that Londoners called Little Italy, a dense, lively community of Italian immigrants clustered in the streets around Holborn, making their livings as organ grinders, street musicians, glass workers, and plaster figurine sellers. Gatti started small, as immigrants tend to do, a stall selling waffles and hot chestnuts, a partnership with a fellow Swiss Italian, opening a coffee house that roasted cocoa in the window to draw in curious customers with the smell. And then, in 1851, the same year as the Great Exhibition, when London was showing the world everything that was best and most modern about itself, Carlo Gatti took a step that changed the street food landscape of the entire city. He opened a stand at Hungerford Market, near Charing Cross, and he began selling ice cream for 1 penny. Now, I want you to understand what this meant. Before Carlo Gatti, ice cream in London was not street food. It was not even close to street food. It was a luxury available only to the very wealthy, a delicacy that required ice imported at great expense, skilled preparation, and a kitchen with the equipment to make it. King Charles II had been served ice cream at Windsor Castle in 1672. That is the kind of company it kept. For nearly 200 years, ice cream remained behind the doors of great houses and exclusive establishments. completely inaccessible to anyone who could not afford to be in the same room as it. And then Carlo Gatti put it on a cart for a penny. The reaction was, and I find this wonderful, somewhere between bewilderment and ecstasy. Henry Mayhew recorded accounts of people tasting ice cream on the street for the first time. One man told him that the cold had gotten among the teeth and made you feel as if you toothache all over. He described it like a medical event, toothache all over, because he'd never experienced something that cold go into his mouth before. And yet he, and thousands like him, came back for more. By 1858, just 7 years after Gatti first set up his stand, his business reportedly sold up to 10,000 penny licks in a single day at the height of summer. 10,000 in one day, from one business, and he was not alone for long. Word spread fast. Other Italian immigrants, many of them from the region around Lucca in Tuscany, driven out of their homeland by economic hardship and political upheaval, arrived in London and saw what Gatti had built, and they built their own version of it. By the end of the 19th century, there were estimated to be around 900 Italian ice cream vendors working the streets of London's Little Italy alone. 900 vendors, all of them pushing carts, all of them calling out in Italian, in broken English, in the particular street vendor cry that London would make famous gelati, ecco un poco, ice cream. Here is a little, and here is where the language got interesting, because those words ecco un poco proved too Italian, too fast, too musical for the English ear to catch and hold as heard, and so London did what London has always done with foreign words it finds useful but difficult. It swallowed them whole and spat them back out transformed. Ecco un poco became hokey pokey. The ice cream men became the hokey pokey men, and by 1884, the term hokey pokey had entered the common language of London streets as a descriptor for cheap, sweet, Italian-style ice cream sold from a cart. Whether the phrase hokey cokey, that famous children's game and song, truly derives from this moment, is one of those historical debates that will probably never be fully settled. But the idea that a children's song might have its roots in the cry of an Italian immigrant selling penny ice cream on a Victorian street corner is, I think, rather beautiful. So what was the penny lick? Exactly. Let me describe it. It was a small glass vessel, thick, heavy for its size, with a wide base and a shallow depression at the top. The thickness of the glass was not accidental. It was designed to give the optical illusion that the vessel was deep, and therefore full of much more ice cream than it actually contained. Some versions were almost entirely solid glass, with barely a thimbleful of actual space for the product. The customer paid their penny. The vendor scooped a small amount of ice cream, vanilla, lemon, or strawberry were common flavors into the shallow depression. The customer licked it off, and then, and this is the crucial part, they handed the glass back to the vendor, who took it, looked at it, and either dunked it briefly in a bucket of water that was, by all accounts, not particularly clean, or simply wiped it with a damp cloth that had already been used many times that day, and handed it to the next customer. I want to pause here for a moment, because in 1851, when Carlo Gatti first set up his penny lick stand, the germ theory of disease did not yet exist as a widely accepted scientific framework. Louis Pasteur's foundational work on microorganisms was published in the late 1850s. Robert Koch identified the specific bacterium that causes tuberculosis in 1882. Before those discoveries, the dominant explanation for how disease spread was the miasma theory, the belief that illness arose from bad air, from foul smells, from the invisible vapours of rotting things, not from contact, not from a shared glass. So the vendors who handed an unwashed penny lick from one customer to the next were not, in their own understanding of the world, doing anything dangerous. They were not consciously negligent. They were operating in a world that simply did not yet know what they were doing, which is, I think, an important thing to hold on to, because it is very easy sitting here with everything we know to look back and say, obviously that was going to cause problems. But it was not obvious to them, not at first. The problems, when they came hard, In 1879, an article in the medical journal The Lancet attributed a cholera outbreak directly to the reuse of ice cream glassware. The article described, in clinical and rather unforgettable language, the washing process for the penny lick glasses. It said, "For cleaning, they're dipped into dirty water which contains the mouth secretions of previous buyers, swabbed with a small, wet offensive cloth, and upended on a soiled barrow top, mouth secretions of previous buyers." That phrase did not improve anyone's appetite for ice cream. A London Council medical officer, conducting his own investigation into the contents of street ice cream samples, found what he described in his report as scotchy, bacilli, and truly those are bacterial and fungal forms alongside cotton fibres, straw, human hair, and the remains of various insects, not just bacteria, insects, in the ice cream on the shared glass that the next customer was about to put in their mouth. And in 1898, Dr. Andrew Wilson published an article in the Illustrated London News that targeted the penny lick with specific alarm. He described children queuing for ice cream in the street, taking the glass, licking it, handing it back, each child in the queue exposed to the saliva of every child before them. And he argued that this was a direct vector for the transmission of tuberculosis, which was, in the 1890s, still the single most significant cause of death in urban England. The campaign built, the evidence accumulated, and in 1899, the London County Council banned the penny lick. The ban did not go quietly. The vendors resisted. They argued with some justice that their entire economic survival depended on the penny lick, that they had no alternative serving method, that a ban was a form of cruelty directed specifically at immigrant workers who had no other means of income, and some of them simply continued using the glasses after the ban, hoping not to be caught. The ban was not consistently enforced until a further prohibition in the 1920s, but the pressure was real, and so was the problem it created. If you could no longer sell ice cream in a glass, what could you sell it in? The answer, the elegant, accidental, now completely ubiquitous answer was already out there. In 1888, a woman named Agnes Marshall had included something in her cookery book. Agnes Marshall was remarkable. Born in East London, she became one of the leading culinary figures of the late Victorian era, running her own cookery school on Mortimer Street, writing authoritative books on iced desserts, designing and patenting her own kitchen equipment. She was known, by the 1880s, as the Queen of Ices, and tucked into her 1888 cookbook was a recipe she called cornets with cream, a cone made of thin wafer pastry, rolled while still warm into a shape that could hold a scoop of ice cream. Edible, disposable, no washing required, no shared glass, no mouth secretions, just a crisp, sweet, slightly caramelized piece of pastry that you ate along with the ice cream inside it, and which therefore left no hygiene problem of any kind behind. Agnes Marshall did not commercialize her invention. She published the recipe and moved on. But in 1901, an Italian immigrant living in Manchester named Antonio Valvona filed a patent for a machine specifically designed to bake wafer cones, the first mechanical production system for the edible ice cream cone. And in 1903, Italo Marchioni, an Italian immigrant in New York, patented a similar mold-based device. The cone was born not from a single eureka moment, but from the slow, grinding, tragic accumulation of evidence about what the shared glass was doing to the health of London's children. The waffle cone, that thing you eat at a fairground, that thing your child holds on a summer afternoon, that perfectly ordinary piece of food technology is a direct descendant of a Victorian public health crisis. It was invented because people were getting sick, and someone, eventually, found a better way. Do you ever think about how many things we use without the faintest idea of the problem they were designed to solve? I think about the cone sometimes. I think about Carlo Gatti arriving in London in 1847, selling waffles from a cart in Clerkenwell, building a business that at its height was importing 400 tons of Norwegian ice per year. I think about the children buzzing around the carts like flies about a sugar barrel. As one contemporary described them, I think about the first time a child put something so cold into their mouth that they thought their teeth had all broken at once, and then handed the glass back and went home, and came back the next day for more. And I think about the women in the medical reports, the researchers with their microscopes, the doctors writing indignant articles, the London County Council with their ban, all of them, without knowing it, working toward the invention of the cone. History moves in strange directions, and sometimes the distance between a public health crisis and a perfect summer afternoon is nothing more than a thin layer of baked wafer, rolled while warm, and left to cool. But not everything that was sold on the Victorian street was sweet, or warm, or designed to comfort. Some of what was sold was genuinely strange. Some of it was sold by people operating at the very outer edge of what Victorian London considered acceptable commerce, and some of it was bought by people who had so little left, and needed so badly just to eat something that day, that the question of acceptable simply did not apply. The next part of our story takes us into the darkest corners of Victorian street food, the things they tried to sell, the things that were hidden in plain sight, and the impossible dignity of the people who bought and sold them. There is an interview in Henry Mayhew's writing that I keep coming back to, not because it is the most dramatic thing he documented, not because it involves the strangest food, or the most colourful character, or the most outrageous piece of Victorian villainy, but because it stops me every single time. It is an interview with a child. Mayhew met her in 1849. He found her on a street, as he found most of his subjects, just walking and watching and asking questions. He wrote about her, and his description in the opening lines is one of those sentences that, once read, does not entirely leave you. He wrote, "The little watercress girl who gave me the following statement, although only 8 years of age, had entirely lost all childish ways, and was, indeed, in thoughts and manner, a woman, 8 years old, entirely lost all childish ways. A woman." He described how he tried to speak to her the way one speaks to a child. He asked about her toys. He asked about her games with friends. And the look she gave him, he recorded this. The look of amazement that answered me soon put an end to any attempt at fun on my part. She did not understand the question. She had no toys. She had no games. Those were not part of the world she lived in. The watercress girl was one of the most visible figures at the very bottom of Victorian London's street food economy. Not a seller of hot pies or penny licks or exotic foreign delicacies. She sold watercress, small bundles of the dark green plant, bought at Farringdon Market. She had to be there between 4 and 5 in the morning, or the best stock was already gone, tied into bundles on a doorstep, and carried through the streets calling, 4 bunches a penny, water creases. She wore, on the day Mayhew met her, a thin cotton dress, a threadbare shawl, and carpet slippers so large for her feet that she had to shuffle to keep them on. No covering on her head, her long hair standing out in all directions, stiffened with cold. It was winter, and she was 8 years old, walking to market at 4 in the morning. When Mayhew asked her about the parks of London, whether she ever went to them, whether she liked them, she stopped and looked at him, and she said, "The parks. Where are they?" She did not know what a park was. She had never been to one. Her entire world was the triangle between her family's single room, Farringdon Market, and the streets around Clerkenwell where she sold. She had never left it. Mayhew described the moment when he explained what a park was: grass, trees, carriages, open space, and how her eyes brightened briefly, and she asked, half doubtfully, would they let such as me go there just to look? I want you to sit with that question for a moment. Would they let such as me go there just to look? She was asking permission, from no one in particular, from the world, from the beautiful places she had somehow understood existed, somewhere beyond the market and the cold and the 4 bunches for a penny. She told Mayhew about her days. She got up before dawn. She walked to market with another girl as must be about 14. because she does her back hair up and they bought their watercress and sat on a doorstep and tied it into bundles. They never went home to breakfast until they had sold out. If it was very late and they were hungry, she said she would sometimes buy a penn'orth of pudding, which is very nice with gravy, a penny's worth of pudding. With gravy, when she had not eaten since tea the evening before, she told Mayhew, "I don't have no dinner. Mother gives me 2 slices of bread and butter and a cup of tea for breakfast. And then I go till tea and has the same, we has meat of a Sunday, meat on Sundays." And she said it without complaint. It was simply the rhythm of her life. Bread and butter in the morning, 4 bunches for a penny in the cold, tea at the end of the day, meat, if they were lucky, on Sunday. I want to pause here and say something directly, because I think it is important. The story of Victorian street food, this whole long, vivid, noisy, sometimes hilarious and sometimes appalling story has a centre, and its centre is not the penny lick or the pieman or the Saturday night market. Its centre is the watercress girl, and children like her, and the millions of working class people who survived on the food that all those street sellers provided, day by day, penny by penny, because there is nothing else. Everything else in this story, the clever costermonger, the Saturday night circus, the innovations and the disasters and the entertainments, all of it exists in relationship to this, to the basic, urgent, daily fact of hunger, and the equally urgent, daily fact of people doing something about it. The watercress girl stood at the bottom of the food economy, but she was not alone there. Victorian London's street food world had a dark underbelly that went deeper than anything we have discussed yet. A world of adulteration, of what was actually in the food, and of what happened when hunger was so absolute that the question of what something was made of became almost irrelevant. Friedrich Christian Acum was a German chemist who arrived in London in 1793. He spent years studying the food supply of the city, and in 1820 he published a treatise that sent a shock through the Victorian establishment. He called it a treatise on adulterations of food and culinary poisons, and what he described was not the exception. It was the rule. London bread, he documented, was routinely bulked up with alum and aluminum compound used today in laundry detergent to make it appear whiter and larger. By 1872, Dr. Hassel, who was one of the first systematic investigators of food contamination, demonstrated that half of the bread he examined contained considerable quantities of alum. Half, not a rogue baker, not an isolated scandal, half the bread in the city, tea, the drink that everyone in London consumed in enormous quantities, because it was safer than the water was routinely adulterated with dried leaves from native ash trees, sloe bushes, an elder, curled and artificially coloured on copper plates to look like real tea leaves. An official estimate suggested that £4 million of this fake tea were sold annually, compared with only £6 million of genuine tea. 2/5 of all the tea in London was not tea. Coffee was adulterated with peas and pigeon beans, compressed and ground to look like coffee. Cheese rinds were coloured with vermilion and red lead, both toxic. Pepper was cut with the sweepings of warehouse floors, and pickled vegetables, those bright green pickles that appeared on every working-class table, often owed their colour to copper salts. Acum documented a case of a young woman who ate a copper-adulterated pickle and died 9 days later. The problem was so widespread that in 1856, a parliamentary select committee produced what one historian called a horrifying catalogue of the common adulterants in everyday foodstuffs. Beer was diluted with water and flavoured with sulphuric acid, and a plant-derived intoxicant called Cocculus indicus. Sweets were coloured with toxic pigments, and in 1860, Parliament finally passed the first Food Adulteration Act, which, the historical record notes with some weariness, was poorly enforced and did little to curb the practice. Why did this happen? Why was Victorian London's food so comprehensively, so systematically compromised? The answer is not simply wickedness. The answer is pressure, the same pressure that drove everything in this story. The pressure of a city growing faster than any city had ever grown before. The pressure of millions of hungry people who needed to be fed cheaply. The pressure of thin margins, fierce competition, and a complete absence of the regulatory framework that we now take entirely for granted. The pieman who used rancid butter was not, in most cases, trying to harm anyone. He was trying not to starve himself. The baker who added alum to his flour was competing with every other baker in a crowded market, where the difference between his price and his competitor's price could mean the difference between staying in business and closing his doors. I'm not excusing any of it. The consequences were real and sometimes fatal, but understanding it requires understanding the pressure. And now I want to tell you about something that I find both deeply practical and almost unbearably sad. What did the very poorest people of Victorian London eat when they could not afford even the penny pie, even the watercress, even the halfpenny bowl of eel broth? The answer is offal, not as a delicacy, as the only protein available at a price they could afford. Sheep's trotters, the feet of sheep, prepared by boiling, were sold on the street for 5 for a penny. 5 pieces of food for a penny. Mayhew visited the facility where they were prepared and counted what came out of those great boiling cauldrons every week. 20,000 sets of trotters, 80,000 sheep's feet per week in one facility, and the street sellers who bought them at 5 for a penny sold the feet of approximately 1 million sheep per year to the working classes of London. 1 million! The trotter was not exotic. It was not interesting. It was cheap protein sold to people who needed it, by people who needed to sell it, and it kept a great many people going through the week. There was also tripe, the stomach lining of cattle, and pig's cheeks, and cow heel, and slink. This was the term for prematurely born calves, which were cheaper than any other meat because they could not be sold as regular beef. And broxy, and if you do not know that word, I'm going to tell you and then give you a moment. Broxy was diseased sheep that had died of illness rather than been slaughtered, prepared and sold as food because it was cheaper, because hunger does not stop for quality inspection. I want to be clear about something, because I think it matters. None of the people who ate these things were degraded by eating them. They were poor. They were feeding themselves and their families with what was available and what they could afford. The watercress girl was not degraded by her carpet slippers and her threadbare shawl. She was extraordinary. She was getting up before dawn to walk to market so that her family could eat. And Henry Mayhew, who saw this clearly, who wrote about it with a care and an attention that I find genuinely moving, even now made this point himself. He wrote that the watercress sellers were among the most honest people he encountered in all of his years walking London streets. He wrote that they paid their debts even when they were hungry. He wrote that they prefer the early rising, the walk to market with naked feet along the cold stones, the pinched meal and the day's hard labour to the alternative of theft, which was always available to them and which many people in their circumstances would have taken. They chose not to. They chose the cold stones and the watercress and the 4 bunches for a penny. They chose dignity. There is a moment in Mayhew's interview with the 8-year-old watercress girl that I want to end this part of our story with, because I think it encapsulates something essential about the entire world we have been exploring. Mayhew offered her a hot dinner, and she would not eat it, not because she was not hungry, but because, she said, if she ate too much it made her sick, and she wasn't used to meat, only on a Sunday. Her body had adjusted to scarcity so thoroughly that abundance was itself a problem. That sentence, she wasn't used to meat, only on a Sunday, is not complaint. It is not self-pity. It is simply a description of her life, delivered with the calm of someone for whom this was simply the way things were. And I find it, every time I read it, both heartbreaking and somehow oddly magnificent, because she was still there, still up before dawn, still walking to Farringdon Market in the cold, still asking, with that brief brightening of the eyes, would they let such as me go there just to look? That question, would they let such as me, echoes through everything we have been talking about, through the costermonger with his kingsman and his back slang, through the pieman and his tossed coin, through the eel sellers crying warmth for a halfpenny, through the women waiting in black shawls for the murder of the prices, all of them asking, in their own ways, whether there was a place in the city's abundance for people like them, and all of them, stubbornly, creating that place for themselves, not because anyone invited them, but because they needed to eat, and because they were, in the most fundamental human sense, alive. And yet for all the darkness we have walked through, for all the adulteration and the watercress girl and the broxy and the slink, there is another side to this story, because Victorian street food was not only about survival, it was also, and I promise you this, about deception so elaborate and so creative that it almost deserves to be called an art form. The tricks the sellers played, the sleight of hand at the scales, the oranges boiled to make them look finer, the dead eels mixed with the living ones at a ratio of 20 pounds to 5, the language invented to keep the police guessing, the whole brilliantly improvised theatre of commerce operating without a single licence, without a single regulation, on nothing but nerve and hunger and human ingenuity. We are going to look at all of it. Alright, let us talk about the tricks, because every world has its shadow side, and the world of Victorian street food was no different. We have spent time with the honest hunger and the real hardship, and the genuine creativity of the people who fed London. But now I want to show you the other corner of the same room, the place where ingenuity curled into something a bit more morally complicated, where the line between survival and swindle got blurry in the lamplight, where a careful buyer needed to know what they were buying, and often could not be entirely sure. Henry Mayhew had a chapter in his great survey of London's working poor that he titled, with magnificent directness, of the tricks of costermongers. Not alleged tricks, not rumoured tricks, just the tricks, and he documented them with the same careful, almost cheerful thoroughness that he applied to everything else. Let us start with the oranges. 2 costermongers admitted to Mayhew directly, without apparent embarrassment, that they boiled their oranges before putting them out for sale. Boiled them in hot water. And the reason was this: boiling made the oranges swell. They plumped up, turned a brighter colour, looked fuller and juicier and more magnificent than they actually were. One seller explained to Mayhew, "It makes them look finer ones, but it spoils them." I want you to appreciate the candour of that sentence. It makes them look finer, but it spoils them. He was not unaware that he was deceiving his customers. He simply understood the economics of the situation. A boiled orange looked like a premium orange. A premium-looking orange commanded a better price. And a boiled orange turned brown and worthless within 48 hours. But by then, the customer was already gone. The apples had their own system. Inferior quality apples, the ones the trade called gorfs, were rubbed hard to make them look bright and feel soft. Then they were mixed with apples of a superior description. The good ones on top, the gorfs underneath. The customer reached in for what looked like a good apple, and got something that had been carefully positioned to be noticed. What happened to the rest of the barrel was their problem, not the seller's. This is, I would note, essentially the same technique used in supermarket displays today. Some things do not change. The eels, as I have already told you, had their own particular wrinkle in the honesty question. Mayhew documented that dead eels that had expired in the holding tanks, and were therefore technically no longer fit for consumption, were mixed with live ones. The proportion, he recorded, was 20 pounds of dead eels to 5 pounds of living ones. And Mayhew noted, with the weary precision of a man who had checked, equal quantities of each were considered very fair dealing. Equal quantities, half living, half dead. Considered fair, one eel seller offered Mayhew what I consider an entirely reasonable, if somewhat unsettling, philosophical defence of the practice. He said, "I don't know why dead eels should be objected to. Live eels go dead in the pot, don't they?" He had a point. I cannot entirely argue with the logic. The end result, in terms of what went into the pot, was the same The problem was purely the condition at the moment of sale, and the customer had no way of verifying it. And then there were the weights, the scales, the measures. This is where Victorian market fraud moved from the philosophically defensible to the straightforwardly dishonest. Mayhew documented that weights were flattened, physically deformed to make them look bigger and heavier than they were. A weight that appeared to be 1 pound was actually somewhat less. And the measuring vessels, the quart pots used to measure out peas or nuts or grain, were fitted with thick or false bottoms. A quart measuring pot that was visually indistinguishable from a genuine one might actually hold only 1.5 pints. You paid for a quart, you received considerably less. And because you were standing in a crowded market, surrounded by noise and people and competing sellers, and because you were probably buying after dark or by lamplight, and because you had neither the time nor the equipment to verify the measurement, you had absolutely no way of knowing. Now I want to be careful here, because I think historical fairness requires it. Mayhew himself was careful about it too. After documenting all of these tricks in considerable detail, he turned around and wrote something that I think deserves equal weight. He wrote that in his own personal experience, costermongers were far less dishonest than they are usually believed to be. The tricks existed. They were real, but they were not universal. Many costermongers were scrupulously honest with their regular customers, people they saw every week, people whose continued loyalty was worth more than the short-term gain of a boiled orange. The tricks, by and large, were reserved for strangers, for the Sunday morning crowds who came from different neighbourhoods, for the late-night buyers who would not be back, for the casual shopper rather than the established regular, which does not make the tricks right. But it does make them human. It makes them comprehensible in the context of a world where every halfpenny mattered. And this brings me to something I want to share with you, because I think it is one of the most genuinely delightful and completely unexpected chapters in the history of Victorian street food. It is the story of fried fish, and how it became the most significant immigrant contribution to British food culture in the entire history of the island. The practice of frying fish in batter did not originate in Britain. It originated, best as food historians can determine, in Sephardic Jewish cuisine, specifically in the cooking traditions of Sephardic Jewish families who had lived for centuries in Spain and Portugal, who were known as the Sephardim, from the Hebrew word for Spain. These were communities that had lived in relative peace under Moorish rule in the Iberian Peninsula for hundreds of years, maintaining their religious laws and practices alongside their Muslim and Christian neighbours. One of those practices was this: observant Jews could not cook on the Jewish Sabbath, which runs from sundown Friday to sundown Saturday. So on Friday afternoon, Jewish cooks would prepare food that could be eaten cold the following day without needing to be reheated. And one of the dishes they developed for this purpose was white fish, typically cod or haddock, coated in a thin layer of flour and fried in oil. The coating preserved the fish. It could be eaten cold the next day without losing its essential character. It was flavourful, filling, portable, and delicious. The Spanish called it pescado frito, freed fish. When Sephardic Jewish families fled persecution in Spain and Portugal, the Inquisition, the forced conversions, the expulsions, many of them eventually made their way to England. Significant numbers settled in the East End of London in the 16th and 17th centuries, and more arrived after Oliver Cromwell formally readmitted Jews to England in 1656, and they brought their fried fish with them, not just as a private domestic practice. They began selling it in the streets. Jewish sellers in the East End carried trays hung from their necks on leather straps, containing pieces of fish fried in the Jewish fashion, and sold them to anyone who wanted one. By 1781, a British cookbook referred to the Jews' way of preserving all sorts of fish. By the early 19th century, Charles Dickens was describing fried fish warehouses in the streets of London in his novel Oliver Twist, published in 1837, treating them as familiar landmarks that his readers would recognise without explanation. Thomas Jefferson, during a visit to England, wrote about sampling fried fish in the Jewish fashion. The American founding father, eating East End Jewish street food. History contains multitudes. By 1845, when the cookery writer Alexis Soyer published a recipe titled Fried Fish, Jewish fashion describing fish dipped in batter of flour and water before frying the dish had already completed most of its journey from a private religious practice to a publicly beloved London street food. And then, around 1860, a Jewish immigrant named Joseph Malin took the next step. He opened what is widely considered to be the first recorded combined fish and chip shop in the East End of London. The chips were already popular. Fried potatoes had arrived in working-class London eating establishments from various directions, carried by Irish navvies and French Huguenot immigrants and general urban ingenuity. Joseph Malin looked at the fish, he looked at the chips, and he put them together. His shop remained in business until the 1970s. By 1910, just 50 years after Marlin's opened, there were 25,000 fish and chip shops across the United Kingdom. By 1935, that number had grown to 35,000. George Orwell wrote that fish and chips, alongside cinema and radio, was one of the things that averted revolution in Britain that kept the ordinary people sane and fed, and not entirely at the end of their rope. Winston Churchill, during the Second World War, kept fish and chips off the rationing list precisely because he understood what it meant to the morale of the country. He reportedly called it the Good Companions. Here is what I find genuinely extraordinary about this story. Britain's most iconic national dish. The food that Churchill protected from wartime rationing. The food that George Orwell said kept the country from revolution. The food that 25,000 shops were selling by 1910 did not come from Britain. It came from a centuries-old Jewish religious practice, from the Sephardic families who fried fish on Friday afternoons so that they could eat cold on Saturday, from the immigrant sellers in the East End who hung trays from their necks and sold to anyone who would buy, from Joseph Malin, who had the idea of putting the fish and the chips on the same plate. The most British of all British foods was invented by refugees, running from persecution, carrying their recipes with them, feeding a city that had, in many ways, no idea what it was receiving. And this, I think, is the real lesson of the Victorian street food story. Not just the tricks and the penny licks and the watercress girl, not just the Saturday night market and the boiled oranges and the false-bottomed measures, but this, the food that has defined a nation, the food that is most immediately, most viscerally associated with being British came from somewhere else, from people who were not originally from there, from communities who arrived with nothing and built something, from the long, complicated, wonderful, sometimes terrible, sometimes magnificent history of people moving to a place and feeding the people who were already there. The eel was Dutch, the ice cream was Italian, the pie was shaped by Irish and Jewish and Italian hands, the coffee came from Africa and Arabia, the watercress was sold by the daughters of Irish famine survivors. London fed itself on the whole world, and the whole world became, in ways that nobody entirely planned, London. And yet for all the richness, all the ingenuity, all the delicious complexity of this story, there is one more dimension to Victorian street food that we have not yet fully explored. The moment when the food vendors and their customers sat down, not on a doorstep, not standing at a corner, but inside, in a room, at a table, and what it meant, what it actually, socially, emotionally meant for a working-class Londoner to have a place to sit and eat, in public, with their dignity intact. That story involves the pie shops, yes, but it also involves something darker, something the Victorian authorities very much disapproved of, and something that was arguably the most important social institution in working-class London that nobody with any power ever wanted to acknowledge existed. Something shifts when you stop eating standing up. I have been thinking about this for a while now, and I think it matters more than it might first appear. The entire Victorian street food world we have been exploring, the eel sellers, the costermongers, the piermen, the watercress girls, the coffee stall women in the dark before dawn, all of it happened outdoors, in motion, on the move. You bought, you turned away, you ate as you walked, you did not sit. You did not set your things down. You did not have a place. And then quietly, incrementally, starting in the 1840s and reaching full bloom by the end of the Victorian era, something began to change. Let me take you inside. Not into a grand restaurant, not into a club or a hotel or any of the establishments where the respectable middle classes went to demonstrate their respectability, into a pie and mash shop. And I want you to understand what walking through that door actually meant. The inside of a Victorian pie and mash shop was designed with a purpose that was both practical and, I would argue, quietly radical. The walls were covered in glazed white tiles, bright, reflective, immaculately clean, sometimes green tiles too, set in patterns, sometimes embedded mirrors, which caught the light and made the room feel larger than it was. The tables were marble, not simulated marble, real marble, cold to the touch, impossible to stain, wiped down and gleaming at all times. The floors were originally wood. Covered in sawdust, the sawdust was there to catch the eel bones that customers spat out as they ate, which is an image that requires a moment to fully appreciate. Spat out eel bones landing on sawdust, Victorian workingmen's dining, in its full, unvarnished reality. And yet the marble, the tiles, the gleaming surfaces, these were not there by accident. The owners of these shops understood exactly what they were selling. Not just pies and mash and eel liquor. They were selling the experience of eating in a clean place, at a table, like someone whose life had a table in it. One historian of the eel, pie and mash tradition described these early shops as respectable establishments, and then stopped to note that this word deserves particular weight in the context of Victorian London, respectable, in a society where respectability was the central moral category, the dividing line between those who had it and those who did not, the aspiration that governed everything from the cut of your coat to the street you lived in. Being able to eat in a respectable place was not a small thing. It was, in a certain sense, everything. The aspiring working man, the plumber, the carpenter, the dock foreman, the craftsman could not eat in a restaurant. Not without money he did not have, not without clothes he did not own, not without crossing a social boundary that was enforced not by law but by something much more effective, mutual embarrassment. But he could walk into a pie and mash shop. He could sit at a marble table. He could be served. He could eat his penny pie and his mash and his liquor from a plate, with a fork and spoon, never a knife, by the unwritten rules of the trade, and he could do it in a tiled room that looked, by any reasonable standard, as well appointed as anything available to him. For the duration of that meal, the categories dissolved a little, just a little, but enough to matter. Now, and I want to be honest about this, because the history's complicated. Not everyone in Victorian London had even this. Not everyone could afford the pie shop, even at a penny. And for those people, the other institution of working-class eating and socialisation was the beer shop, the public house, the place that everyone who cared about the moral condition of the working classes looked at with alarm, and the place that, for millions of people, was the most important room in their social lives. Mayhew documented that there were approximately 400 beer shops in London specifically patronised by, and principally supported by, costermongers. 400, just for one community of street sellers. He wrote about these places with the careful neutrality of someone who wanted you to form your own judgment. He described how the men who arrived first in the beer shop would talk over the state of trade and the markets, and how the later arrivals would enter directly into what he called the serious business of the evening: amusement, cards, skittles, sparring with boxing gloves, sometimes the playing of card games, cribbage, all fours, all fives for beer, with betting going on among the players and the watchers alike. And Mayhew noted something that I find rather wonderful. He observed that the costermongers, who can neither read nor write, and who have no knowledge of the multiplication table, are skilful in all the intricacies and calculations of cribbage. They could not do arithmetic. but they could do the specific mental mathematics of cribbage, a game that requires keeping running tallies, counting combinations, tracking probability with complete competence. The human mind finds what it needs to find when something matters. Mayhew wrote about home, or rather, the absence of it. He wrote that for the costermonger, home has few attractions to a man whose life is a street life. Even those who are influenced by family ties and affections prefer to the beer shop the conversation, warmth, and merriment where they can take their ease among their mates. And then came the sentence that I think explains everything about the role of food and drink establishments in working-class Victorian life. That word home is rarely mentioned among them. Home, rarely mentioned, because home, for most of these people, was one room, shared by an entire family, no fire you could sit beside without burning something, no space to move, no privacy, no warmth that did not cost money to produce. The beer shop was warm, the beer shop was lit, the beer shop had other people in it, people who knew your name, who knew your trade, who would argue with you about market prices and let you win at cards occasionally, and would still be there next week. The beer shop was, for a vast number of working-class Londoners, the only real social life available to them. I want to be careful here, because the Victorian conversation about working-class drinking tends to go in one direction very quickly, and I am not sure that direction is always right. The temperance movement, the organised campaign against alcohol that grew throughout the Victorian era, reaching its peak of influence in the 1870s and 1880s, looked at the beer shop and saw degradation. Poverty deepened by drink, wages poured into pint glasses instead of food, families suffering while father sat in the warm, and these were real problems. They were documented. The Saturday night pattern that Mayhew described, wages paid at the pub. The wife arriving to find a portion already drunk, this happened. It happened to real families. I'm not romanticising it, but here is what the temperance movement missed. Or rather, here is what it refused to see. The beer shop was not only a place of vice, it was the only place most of these men could reliably go. It was the working-class equivalent of the gentleman's club, the place where business information was exchanged, where community was maintained, where disputes were settled without reference to any external authority. A one-sided historian of Victorian poverty once wrote that beer took the place which later became filled with cigarettes and television, the basis of leisure, the ordinary background hum of a life, not a catastrophe, just a way of getting through. And what did the working-class Victorian eat in the beer shop? Well, at its most basic, the food and the drink were inseparable. You went for the beer, and you stayed for the food, or perhaps the other way around. Pickled whelks, sold in the public houses by the sellers who made their rounds, sheep's trotters, brought in from the street and eaten at the bar, hot pies, when the peaman stuck his head through the door calling here's all oat, toss or buy, bread and cheese, the occasional kipper, nothing elaborate, nothing designed, just the available, the cheap, the hot, the sustaining, and surrounding all of it the conversation, which was, in the end, the real product being sold, not the beer, not the food, the warmth, the recognition, the simple fact of being among people who knew you. I have been thinking, as we have moved through this world, about what connects the pie and mash shop and the beer shop and the coffee stall and the Saturday night market. They are very different places. They serve different purposes. They attract different kinds of people, but they all do one essential thing. They create the conditions under which poor people can eat together, in public, with some dignity, and I think that is worth pausing on, because in a world without those places, in a world where the only option was standing in the street, in the rain, eating something questionable out of a tin box, the social fabric of working-class London would have been much thinner, much colder, much more alone. The pie shop with its marble tables was not just a place to buy food, it was a space where you could sit like a person who had the right to sit. The beer shop was not just a place to drink, it was a room where you were known. The coffee stall at 4 in the morning was not just hot liquid, it was a guiding star, As one working man described it, a light in the dark, that told you someone was there, that you did not have to be cold alone, feed someone, and you have met one need, give someone a place to eat together, and you have done something much harder to quantify, something that, in the history books, tends to get overlooked in favour of statistics about wages and mortality rates and the price of bread, but which mattered enormously to the people who experienced it, and which echoes, if you listen for it, in every corner of this story. There is one more thing I want to tell you before we bring this whole extraordinary world into focus. One more question to answer. What became of it all? What happened to the 6,000 vendors, the 37 street markets, the eel sellers and the pie men and the watercress girls and the hokey-pokey men and the muffin man with his bell? What happened when the Victorian era ended, when the 20th century arrived with its new ideas about hygiene and regulation, and what a city was supposed to look like? The answer, as it turns out, is part triumph and part loss, part survival and part disappearance, and in its own way, it is the most human part of this entire story. Something happened in the 1870s that changed the game, quietly, without fanfare, without a single street vendor being consulted or even informed. In 1875, the British Parliament passed the Sale of Food and Drugs Act, and for the first time in the history of the country, after Frederick Ackham had spent 50 years being ignored, after the Lancet had published its horrifying analyses of food samples, after the 1860 Act had been passed and then routinely disregarded, there was actual enforceable law, a law that said, if you sell food that endangers health, you can be prosecuted. If you deceive a customer through misrepresentation, you can be prosecuted. Public analysts were appointed, samples could be tested, courts could convict. It was not perfect. It was not comprehensive. Adulteration continued in various forms for decades afterward. But the line had been drawn. The air of caveat emptor let the buyer beware. The operating principle of Victorian commerce from the farthing pickle to the penny pie was starting, slowly, to end. And it was not just regulation. Something else was changing in the streets at the same time. Something visible. The railways had arrived. The first major London lines had opened in the 1830s and 40s. By the 1860s, the railway network was dense enough that fresh produce from the countryside could reach London in hours rather than days. The refrigerated ship arrived in the 1870s, bringing cheap meat from Australia and New Zealand across thousands of miles of ocean. Canned food, invented earlier in the century, was becoming more widely available. And most significantly for the street food world, the price of food was falling. Falling in real terms, falling fast enough that a working-class family in the 1880s could afford things that had been entirely out of reach 20 years earlier. Fresh meat, more regularly, more variety, more options. And here is the paradox that sits at the heart of this transition. The better things got, the more food became available. The cheaper it became. The safer the regulations made it, the less essential the street food network became. The watercress girl's family, by the 1880s, might have an actual oven in their lodgings. The factory worker's wife might have access to a wider variety of food from the corner shop than she had ever had from the costermonger's barrow. The rising standard of living, combined with better food distribution and the beginnings of food law, slowly, incrementally, started to erode the desperate necessity that had made the street food world so extraordinary. People still bought from the streets. They would continue to do so for decades, but it was no longer, for most of them, the only option, and when something stops being the only option, it starts becoming a choice. And choices have a different economic logic than necessities, but I want to tell you about something specific. Something that happened in 1884 that I find completely wonderful, and which is, in some ways, the most perfect single illustration of the thread that runs from the Victorian street food world to the present day. In 1884, in the city of Leeds in the north of England, a young man set up a stall in Kirkgate Market. He was 25 years old, He had arrived in England a few years earlier from a Jewish ghetto in the Russian-controlled area of Poland, a region that is now Belarus fleeing persecution, speaking almost no English, arriving in a country he did not know with very little money, and a peddler's experience of selling things to people. His name was Michael Marks. He had borrowed £5, the equivalent of approximately £700 today, from a local businessman named Isaac Dewhurst, and with that £5, he set up his stall, and on a sign above it, he put a slogan that was as simple and as radical as anything that had appeared in the Victorian marketplace. Don't ask the price, it's a penny. Everything on the stall. One price. No haggling. No mystery. No false bottom measures or boiled orange tricks. Just, here is what I have. It cost a penny. Take it or leave it. Now, I want you to think about what that meant in the context of everything we have been discussing. The Victorian street food world, as we have seen, was full of uncertainty. You did not always know what you were buying. You did not always know how much it would cost until you asked. You could not always verify the weight, the freshness, the quality, or even the species of what was being sold to you. The entire economy of the street ran on incomplete information, and incomplete information created the space for the boiled orange and the dead eel and the false bottom of the measuring pot. Michael Marks eliminated all of that. One price, everything visible. The stall became his because of what it was not, as much as what it was. It was not a mystery. It was not a trap. It was not a negotiation you could lose. The penny bazaar was a response to the street market's most fundamental problem, the uncertainty of the transaction, and it worked. By 1894, Marks had expanded to the point where he needed a business partner. He took on Thomas Spencer, a bookkeeper, who invested £300 for a half share. By 1900, there were 36 Marks and Spencer penny bazaars across the United Kingdom. By 1930, the company was a national institution, trading in hundreds of stores. By 1997, it became the first British retailer to report a pre-tax profit of over £1 billion. £1 billion, built on a £5 loan and a sign that said, "Don't ask the price, it's a penny." Michael Marks was a Polish-Jewish immigrant who began as a peddler. The empire he built grew directly from the logic and the limitations and the eventual problems of the Victorian street market. The story of what replaced the Victorian street food world is, in some ways, the story of Victorian street food's own children. The costermongers did not simply disappear, they adapted. Many of them, as the century turned and the new regulations made street trading more difficult, took up pitches in the licence-covered markets, Portobello Road, Petticoat Lane, Borough Market. These were not inventions of the 20th century. They were the Victorian street market, tidied up and moved indoors, regulated, licensed, given permanent addresses. The energy was the same. The traders' families were often the same families, but the chaos was gradually contained, and the foods themselves, what happened to them, the hot baked potato, kept warm in a tin box over charcoal, became the baked potato cart, became the baked potato van, became the fast food option available at every supermarket. The fried fish, sold by Jewish immigrants in the East End on trays hung from their necks, became fish and chips, became 25,000 chip shops by 1910, became the national dish that Winston Churchill refused to ration in wartime. The penny pie became the Cornish pasty, became the sandwich, became the meal deal. The coffee stall before dawn became the corner newsagent, became the commuter coffee chain. Every single thing we eat quickly, on the go, while walking somewhere, while running late, while not quite having time for a proper meal, all of it traces back, in one way or another, to the 6,000 vendors of Victorian London, feeding a city that could not feed itself. But some things did not transform. Some things simply ended, and I want to spend a moment with those things, with what was lost. Not in a sentimental way, not in a way that pretends the penny lick was actually fine or that food adulteration was charming, but honestly, because I think losses deserve to be named. The Muffin Man's bell rang for the last time during the Second World War. Not because he was banned, not because the muffins were terrible or the bell was too loud, but because the world had simply moved on. The rationing and disruption of wartime rearranged London's food geography in ways that some things did not survive, and when the war ended and the city rebuilt, the particular corner of morning culture that the Muffin Man had occupied was not rebuilt with it. His bell fell silent somewhere in the 1940s, and the street that it had rung down for over a century became, without ceremony, just a street. Tubby Isaac's jellied eel stall in Whitechapel opened in 1919. For 94 years, it occupied a corner at the edge of Petticoat Lane Market, selling jellied eels and cockles and whelks to the East End community that had relied on them for generations. It became so beloved that it was considered a landmark, a piece of living history, something that connected the present to the Victorian world through the direct experience of food. In 2013, Tubby Isaac's closed. The reasons were practical: rising costs, falling demand, a neighbourhood that had changed around it and was still changing. The stall that had lasted through 2 world wars and the London Blitz was defeated by economics. It sold its last portion of jellied eels and shut its shutters, and a small, specific thread back to the Victorian street food world was cut. The European eel, as I mentioned before, is now critically endangered. Since 1980, the population has declined by 95%, the creature that fed medieval kings, that the Dutch fishermen brought in barges up the Thames, that kept London's working classes alive through the worst years of industrial poverty is running out. The 34 pie and mash shops still operating in London today, down from over 110 at the end of the Victorian era, are, many of them, already serving eel that comes pre-jellied from the Netherlands, because there are no longer enough eels in the Thames to supply them from the river that once swarmed with them, the river that eel traps once obstructed so badly they warranted a mention in the Magna Carta. And yet, because I do not want to leave us entirely in loss, Borough Market in London, which has been a site of food trading since at least the 12th century, which supplied the Victorian street sellers who bought their produce early in the morning from the same location, is today one of the most visited food markets in Europe. Brick Lane Market still operates, Portobello Road still operates, Petticoat Lane still operates, and something else happened, too, something that I think is genuinely worth noting as a form of continuity: the 21st century street food movement, the food trucks, the pop-up markets, the outdoor stalls, the street food festivals that have become a feature of every major British city is, at its root, a direct descendant of the Victorian tradition. Different food, different prices, different regulatory framework, but the same essential logic: food made accessible to people who are moving through a city, sold directly from the person who made it, at a price that does not require a reservation or a dress code or any of the other markers of social distance that the restaurant system erects. The Victorian street food seller and the modern street food vendor are separated by 150 years, but they are selling the same thing. Not just food, ease, access, the right to eat without complication, while being alive in a city. There is one more chapter in this story, the final one, and it is, I think, the most important, because we have spent all of this time together looking at what Victorian London ate, and how it was sold, and who sold it, and what it cost, and what it was made of, and what happened to it. But we have not fully answered the question underneath all of that, the question of what it means, not historically, not economically, but personally. Why does this story about eel sellers and penny licks and watercress girls and boiled oranges and a Polish immigrant's market stall, why does it matter to us, right now, tonight, in whatever room you are in, with whatever light is low? That is what we are going to talk about next. What does it mean? That is the question I have been sitting with all evening. All of us have been sitting with it, in a sense. For the entire length of this story, we have walked through the noise and the light of the Victorian street. We have met the costermonger and the pieman and the watercress girl and the hokey-pokey man and the eel seller calling out from under a railway arch. We have smelled the charcoal and the naphtha and the hot sugar and the river. We have watched the Saturday night market rise and fall and rise again. We have followed the penny from one cold hand to another, and now it is quiet, and I want to tell you what I think it all means. Here is the thing about history. The version we usually get, the version in the textbooks, in the documentary narration, in the confident sentences that begin with dates and end with explanations, that version tends to be about systems, economic systems, political systems, the rise and fall of institutions, the decisions of powerful people about other people's lives, and those things are real, and they matter, but they do not breathe. They do not smell of anything. They do not have a voice that goes hoarse from shouting all day, or cold feet from standing at a market stall since 4 a.m, or a face that brightens for half a second when someone mentions a park they have never seen. The street food of Victorian London is, at its heart, a breathing history. It is history that smells of something. What I find most extraordinary about this world, and I have spent considerable time with it, is not the strangeness of what they ate, not the penny lick or the sheep's trotter or the eel in aspic. It is the ordinariness of why they ate it. They were hungry, they needed something hot, they had a penny, or they had half a penny, or, on the worst days, they had nothing, and they stood near the coffee stall and let the warmth from someone else's cup reach them through the cold air for a moment before walking on. This is not exotic. This is not distant. This is not safely historical in the way that castles and coronations are historical. This is last Tuesday morning in a different century. I think about the statistics sometimes. London's population growing from under 1 million to over 6.5 million in a single century. 30 to 45,000 costermongers, 6,000 food vendors, 112 markets by 1893, 5,000 stalls. These are enormous numbers. But the story is not in the numbers. The story is in the fact that every single one of those 37 Saturday night markets, every single one of those 5,000 stalls, every single penny pie and hot eel and boiled orange was the result of a specific person making a specific decision. To get up at 4 a.m, to carry something heavy through the dark, to stand in the cold, to shout until their voice gave out, to take the risk that today's stock might not sell, to do the same thing again the following morning. And why? Because they had to, because it was the only way, because the city was hungry, and they were part of the city, and they understood what that meant. There is a word that appears throughout Henry Mayhew's writing when he discusses the working people of London streets, not hunger, though that appears constantly, not poverty, though that appears on every page. The word that keeps coming back, in the testimony of the people he interviewed, is pride, the costermonger who would sooner starve than pawn his kinsman, the watercress girl who did not want to be pitied, the eel seller who described his work as a delicacy for the poor, the pie shop owner who designed his marble-topped tables to look like something worth sitting at, the Italian vendor who called out "Ecco un poco here" as a little "here is something," as though what he was offering, however small, however imperfect, was genuinely worth having. These were people who maintained their dignity in conditions that were specifically designed not by malice, but by the grinding, impersonal logic of industrial capitalism to wear it away, and they held on to it with both hands, sometimes with a silk neckerchief and a secret language, sometimes with a tiny glass of ice cream, sometimes with 4 bunches of watercress for a penny. But they held on. I want to say something about what this story means for now, not in a lectury way, not in the way that history sometimes gets weaponized as a lesson, but honestly, because I think there is something genuine here that is worth saying out loud. We live in a world that, by almost every measurable standard, feeds itself better than the world of 1850. We have food safety laws, we have refrigeration, we have supply chains that can bring fresh produce from every corner of the planet to a supermarket shelf. We have, Most of us in the places where these stories are told and heard, options, real options, the ability to choose what we eat, and where, and when, and from whom, and we often treat that as a given, as a right so basic that it barely registers. But the Victorian street food world is a reminder that it was not always given, that there was a time not so long ago, in the grand scale of things, when the difference between having a meal and not having one was a matter of about a halfpenny, and the goodwill of an eel seller who would sometimes give away his surplus to the people refused entry to the workhouse, lending them his charcoal fire for warmth, that there was a time when the most reliable institution of working-class social life was a room above a pub where you could be warm for the price of a pint, because warmth otherwise cost money you did not have, that there was a time when a plate of food on a marble table was not a small thing. It was proof that you existed, that you were worth feeding, that you had a place in the world. I think about the ice cream cone, not the ice cream. The cone, the edible, disposably, sanitary, perfectly portable cone that replaced the penny lick. Not because someone had a brilliant idea one morning, but because children were getting sick from a shared glass in a polluted city, and someone found a better way. The cone is a solution to a problem. It is a piece of engineering designed to address a specific human suffering, and now we eat it on hot summer days without a second thought about tuberculosis or cholera, or the river water used to rinse the glass of the previous customer. We just eat the cone. We enjoy the ice cream. We throw away the wrapper, and the entire history of how we got here, the Dutch eel barges, the Polish immigrant market stall, the Sephardic Jewish street seller with a tray of fried fish, the 8-year-old girl with carpet slippers and a basket of watercress, the costermonger's hoarse voice at 4 a.m. on the new cut. All of that is present, invisibly, in every single ordinary meal we eat, every time you grab something on the go, every time you stop at a food truck, every time you pick up fish and chips on the way home, every time you sit at a table that someone else wiped clean before you arrived, every time you eat without wondering whether you can trust what is in it. History is not always something that happened somewhere else to someone else a long time ago. Sometimes it is the precise, unbroken chain of small human decisions that leads directly to the sandwich in your hand, to the coffee in the cup you are holding, to the table you are sitting at, to the very fact that you can read a menu and know that the price is the price, and nothing more will be asked of you. Michael Mark stood in a market in Leeds in 1884 with a £5 loan and a sign that said, "Don't ask the price, it's a penny." That sign became an empire that employs tens of thousands of people. But before it was an empire, it was a promise. A simple, clear promise made by a man with almost nothing to a customer who had very little more. Here is what I have. Here is what it costs. You can trust me. That promise in one form or another is what the entire Victorian street food world was reaching toward. Through all the tricks and the noise and the cold and the hunger and the occasional boiled orange, it was reaching toward the idea that commerce between people could be honest, that food could be safe, that hunger was a problem worth solving, that everyone who was cold and tired and needed something warm at the end of a long day deserved to find it. We have not solved it completely. We have not even come close. There are still people in every city in the world who are where the watercress girl was, cold, resourceful, tired, getting up before dawn, making something from almost nothing, asking, in one way or another, whether there is a place in the city's abundance for people like them. But we are closer. We are closer because of the people who refused to stop, who kept setting up their stalls, who kept calling out into the noise, who kept doing the small, essential, unheroic work of making sure that the people around them did not go entirely unfed. Before we close tonight, I want to read you one last thing, not from Mayhew, not from a regulation or historical record, just a small thing. An eel seller, documented by Mayhew in the 1850s, a man selling hot eels from a cart near a railway arch on a cold night. He described how, at the end of the evening, When his day was essentially done and he was about to pack up and go home, he would sometimes find that people were gathering near him. People who had been refused entry to the workhouse that night, with nowhere to go, in the cold, and he would give them what was left. Not sell it, give it, and he would lend them his charcoal fire, and they would sit there, around the fire, in the dark under the railway arch, and they would be warm, and they would have something to eat. And then the night would pass. That is Victorian London, not the marble and the gaslight and the empire at its height, not the great exhibitions and the railway networks and the world's largest city at the peak of its industrial power. This, one tired man, a fire made of charcoal, the people who needed it most, and the simple act of staying a little longer than necessary, because it was cold, and because he could. Thank you for being here tonight. Thank you for staying all the way through, for letting the noise of the Victorian street come in through the window for a while, for sitting with the watercress girl and the muffin man and the Italian ice cream seller and the women in black shawls waiting for the murder of the Prices. These were real people. They lived these lives. They fed a city, and they deserved to be remembered. If tonight's story meant something to you, if you found yourself leaning in at some point, or pausing on a particular image, I would love to know. Leave a comment. Tell me which moment landed. Tell me if you ever thought about fish and chips differently after tonight, or the ice cream cone, or the very ordinary miracle of food that you can trust. Subscribe if you would like more evenings like this one. There are so many more stories waiting. Stories of people whose names history almost forgot, who ate and worked and struggled and laughed in the margins of the great events, whose lives, examined closely, turn out to be as extraordinary as anything that happened in a palace or a parliament. I will be here. The light will be soft. The next story is ready, and all you have to do is stay.